Hey everyone, tonight we're starting in the scribe's chamber of a Babylonian temple, a space filled with damp clay, disciplined silence, and a constant pressure to write without error. It might sound like a peaceful job, but for the scribes of ancient Mesopotamia, it was a life of repetition, fatigue, and quiet demands. And that's only the beginning of where we're headed. Before you get too settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these slow, quiet walks through the past. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see where in the world these stories are finding their way. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, or let a fan hum softly in the background. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine sitting on a woven reed mat, your legs tucked beneath you, the coolness of the temple floor pressing through the fabric. Around you, the walls are bare and close, lit only by shafts of filtered light slipping through narrow slits above. The air smells faintly of damp clay, soot, and drying ink. You've been here for hours, copying a passage word for word from an older tablet. Your back aches. Your fingers are sore. You know that one slip of the stylus could undo the entire morning's work. This is the life of a Babylonian scribe. Not a poet or philosopher, but a careful copyist, a recorder of rituals and inventories, tax records, and temple decrees. To outsiders, it might seem like a privileged life. After all, only a small part of the population could read or write. Literacy was a special skill, often associated with wisdom and status. But the daily reality was much more exhausting. The temple where you work rises from the dusty streets of Babylon like a mountain of baked brick and ambition. Its walls tower above the marketplace, casting long shadows across the narrow alleys where merchants hawk their wares and children play with clay toys. Inside these walls, the world operates differently. Time moves according to ritual schedules rather than the rhythm of commerce. The priests who glide through the corridors in their pristine robes speak in hushed tones about divine matters, but you know the truth behind their reverence. Every prayer they recite, every offering they present, every ceremony they perform depends entirely on the accuracy of your work. Your workspace is a small chamber tucked away from the main temple halls. The walls are lined with shelves holding hundreds of tablets, some so old their edges have crumbled to dust. The newest ones still gleam with moisture, their surfaces unmarked and waiting. Between them lie the tools of your trade, reed styluses of various sizes, each carved to produce different thicknesses of mark, small bowls for mixing ink, and flat stones for smoothing clay surfaces. The furniture is minimal. A low wooden table, polished smooth by countless hours of use. A water basin for cleaning your hands and tools. A rack for drying completed tablets. Nothing decorative, nothing comfortable. This is a place built for function, not beauty. The hierarchy of the scriptorium reflects the broader social order of Babylon itself. At the top sit the master scribes, men who have spent decades perfecting their craft and now oversee the work of others. They move through the workspace with quiet authority, their eyes sharp enough to catch the slightest error from across the room. Below them are the journeymen, skilled copyists who handle the most important documents. Temple contracts, correspondence with other cities, records of royal decrees. These men have proven their reliability through years of flawless work. They speak little during the day, focused entirely on their tasks. But in the evening, they sometimes gather to discuss the finer points of cuneiform technique or share gossip about palace politics. Then there are scribes like you, competent but not yet trusted with the most critical work. You copy routine records, inventory lists, and ceremonial texts that have been transcribed countless times before. Your tablets are checked and rechecked by the journeyman before being filed away. Any mistake means starting over, and too many mistakes mean losing your position entirely. The work is repetitive but demanding, requiring constant attention to detail and absolute precision in every mark. At the bottom of the hierarchy are the apprentices, boys between 8 and 15 years old who spend their days learning the fundamentals of writing. They practice basic signs on cheap clay tablets that are wiped clean and reused. Their mistakes are corrected with sharp words and sometimes sharper switches. The sound of their styluses scraping against practice tablets provides a constant background rhythm to your work, a reminder of your own difficult beginning in this profession. Training to become a scribe began early. Boys were sent to the Edaba, the tablet house, at a young age. There, under the eyes of strict instructors, they spent their days memorizing hundreds of cuneiform signs and copying them again and again until their forms were perfect. Lessons were harsh and repetitive. Teachers demanded precision. Errors were not taken lightly. The learning process was not just intellectual, but deeply physical. Your muscles had to remember each curve and angle of the stylus, each press into the clay. The Edaba was a world unto itself, separated from the warmth of family life and the freedom of childhood play. Students arrived before dawn and worked until the sun set, their days structured around the relentless acquisition of knowledge. The curriculum extended far beyond simple writing. They learned mathematics, studying the complex calculations needed for temple accounting and astronomical observations. They memorized poetry, religious hymns, and legal formulas. They studied the properties of different types of clay and how to prepare writing surfaces. They learned to read and write in both Akkadian and Sumerian, the ancient language still used for religious and scholarly texts. Physical punishment was common and accepted. A student who formed a sign incorrectly might have his knuckles rapped with a reed. One who spoke out of turn could be made to stand in the corner for hours. More serious infractions resulted in beatings that left marks lasting for days. The philosophy behind such harsh treatment was simple. Writing was sacred work, and those who would practice it must be purified of any tendency toward carelessness or disrespect. The discipline was meant to forge not just skilled hands, but disciplined minds. The social isolation of student scribes was profound. While other children played games, learned trades from their fathers, or helped with household tasks, future scribes spent their days hunched over tablets in windowless rooms. They developed close bonds with their fellow students, relationships forged in shared suffering and mutual dependence. These friendships often lasted throughout their careers, creating networks of loyalty and cooperation that extended across the entire literate class. The process of learning to write was painstakingly slow. Each cuneiform sign was composed of wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay with a reed stylus. The angle of the stylus, the depth of the impression, the spacing between marks, all had to be exactly right. A single sign might contain a dozen separate wedges, each requiring precise placement. More complex signs could involve 30 or more individual marks. Students began by learning the most basic signs, simple combinations of vertical and horizontal wedges. Only after months of practice were they allowed to attempt more complex forms. Memory work was equally demanding. Students had to learn not just how to form signs, but what they meant, and how they functioned within the writing system. Cuneiform was not a simple alphabet, but a complex system combining logographic signs that represented entire words or concepts, with syllabic signs that represented sounds. Many signs had multiple meanings depending on context. The sign for day could also mean sun or time, depending on how it was used. Students memorized vast lists of signs and their various meanings, chanting them in unison until the knowledge became automatic. The transition from student to working scribe was marked by a ceremony that acknowledged the young man's mastery of the essential skills. He would be presented with his own set of professional tools, a collection of reed styluses, a personal seal for marking his work, and a small knife for cutting tablets to size. These tools were blessed by the temple priests and became the sacred implements of his trade. From that day forward, he would be held to the same standards as any other scribe. There would be no allowance for inexperience, no tolerance for the kinds of mistakes that had been corrected during his training. Once trained, a scribe's responsibilities expanded. You might be asked to write ritual hymns or list livestock received as temple offerings. You might translate messages between Akkadian and Sumerian, or copy astronomical records for priests tracking omens in the sky. All of it had to be exact. Clay tablets, once dried, could not be edited. There were no margins, no scribbles or corrections. You worked slowly, deliberately, knowing that one sign out of place could cause confusion or worse, be interpreted as disrespect. The variety of texts you might be asked to produce was staggering. On any given day, you could find yourself copying a hymn, praising the goddess Ishtar, recording the delivery of barley from a temple farm, transcribing a legal contract between merchants, or preparing a letter from your temple's high priest to his counterpart in a distant city. Each type of document required different skills and knowledge. Religious texts demanded absolute accuracy in every word, as any change could alter the meaning of a prayer or invocation. Legal documents required precise formatting and the inclusion of specific phrases that gave them binding authority. Administrative records needed clear organization and careful attention to numbers and quantities. The pressure to avoid errors was constant and intense. In a world where writing was sacred, mistakes were not mere inconveniences, but potential acts of sacrilege. A wrongly copied religious text could anger the gods. An error in a legal document could void a contract or create grounds for dispute. A mistake in temple records could result in shortages of supplies needed for ceremonies or festivals. The consequences of carelessness extended far beyond the individual scribe to affect the entire community. Quality control was built into every aspect of the work. Tablets were checked in multiple stages of production. When you completed a text, it was reviewed by a senior scribe who compared it line by line with the original. Any discrepancies, no matter how small, required the entire tablet to be scrapped and the work begun again. Even tablets that passed this initial inspection were subject to random checks by the master scribes. A pattern of errors, even minor ones, could result in demotion or dismissal. The tools of the trade were simple, but required constant maintenance. Reed styluses had to be cut fresh regularly, as the tips would wear down or split after extended use. The ideal stylus was made from a particular type of reed that grew in marshy areas near the rivers. It had to be cut at the right season, when the plant was neither too green nor too dry. The tip was carved to a precise triangular shape that would produce clean, sharp wedges when pressed into clay. A master scribe could tell the quality of another's work simply by examining the consistency and clarity of the wedge marks. Clay preparation was an art in itself. The clay had to be of the right consistency, not too wet or too dry, mixed with just the right amount of temper to prevent cracking as it dried. Different types of documents required different qualities of clay. Important contracts and religious texts used the finest clay, carefully prepared and smooth. Routine records might use coarser material, but even these had to meet minimum standards of workability and durability. The physical toll of the work was cumulative and severe. Hours spent in the same position, hunched over tablets, created chronic back and neck problems. The repetitive motions of writing led to pain in the hands and wrists. The dim lighting in most work areas strained the eyes, leading to headaches and, in many cases, early vision problems. Scribes often developed a characteristic posture, with rounded shoulders and a forward-jutting head, the result of years spent peering at small marks on clay surfaces. And the work never stopped. New tablets were needed constantly. Temples ran on records. Every bushel of barley, every jug of oil, every head of sheep had to be accounted for. Ceremonies required precise scripts, and the gods, it was believed, did not tolerate mistakes. You could spend your whole life writing about offerings you never saw, rituals you never performed, and decisions made by people you would never meet. The economic life of the temple depended entirely on accurate record-keeping. Temples were not just religious centers, but major economic institutions. They owned vast tracts of agricultural land, employed hundreds of workers, and engaged in trade with communities hundreds of miles away. They received tribute from vassal cities, rent from tenant farmers, and offerings from worshippers. All of this wealth had to be tracked, managed, and accounted for. The scribes who maintained these records were the invisible backbone of the entire system. Agricultural records were particularly complex. Different crops had different harvest seasons, storage requirements, and uses. Barley was the staple grain, used for bread and beer, but temples also grew wheat, dates, onions, and other vegetables. Each crop had to be recorded separately, with notes about quality, storage location, and intended use. Livestock records were equally detailed. Sheep and goats were raised for meat, milk, and wool. Cattle were used for labor as well as food. Each animal had to be tracked individually, with records of births, deaths, sales, and transfers between temple properties. The responsibility for maintaining these records was enormous. An error in agricultural accounts could lead to shortages during religious festivals or famines during bad harvest years. Mistakes in livestock records could result in the loss of valuable breeding animals or confusion about property ownership. The scribes who handled these documents carried the weight of the entire community's economic well-being on their shoulders. Trade records added another layer of complexity. Babylon was a major commercial center, with merchants traveling to and from distant lands. The temple often acted as a bank, providing loans to merchants and storing valuable goods. These transactions had to be recorded with precise details about quantities, prices, interest rates, and delivery dates. International trade involved multiple currencies and complex exchange rates. A scribe working on commercial documents needed to understand not just writing, but mathematics, law, and business practices. Diplomatic correspondence required its own specialized skills. Letters between temples in different cities often contained coded messages or subtle references that required deep knowledge of politics and history to interpret correctly. The language used in such documents was highly formal, with specific phrases and formulas that had to be employed in exactly the right circumstances. A diplomatic scribe needed to understand not just what was being said, but what was being implied, and how to convey complex political messages without giving offense. Legal documents were perhaps the most demanding of all. Contracts, wills, court records, and property deeds all had to follow precise legal formulas. The language was technical and unforgiving. A single misplaced word could void a contract or create ambiguity that might be exploited by dishonest parties. Legal scribes were often called upon to serve as witnesses in court proceedings, their testimony about the authenticity and accuracy of documents carrying significant weight in legal disputes. Your hands were always stained. The ink clung to your nails and palms, sometimes thick with soot. Your sight might fade early, worn down by long hours in dim light, staring at the fine marks etched into damp clay. You rarely spoke while working. The scriptorium was quiet. The only sounds were the soft scrape of styluses and the occasional creak of a shelf or a whispered correction from a teacher to a younger apprentice. The silence of the scriptorium was more than just a practical necessity. It was a reflection of the sacred nature of the work. Writing was considered a divine gift, a power that connected mortals to the gods. The act of creating written words was a form of prayer, a way of participating in the cosmic order that governed all existence. Unnecessary speech was seen as disrespectful, a trivialization of the sacred process. Even necessary communication was conducted in whispers, with established hand signals used for common requests and corrections. The smell of the scriptorium was distinctive and unmistakable. Fresh clay had an earthy, clean scent that reminded you of rain on dry ground. Drying tablets gave off a dusty smell as moisture evaporated from their surfaces. The ink made from soot and plant resins, added a sharp, slightly bitter note to the air. Over time, these scents became so familiar that you could identify the age and type of any tablet simply by breathing in its aroma. The rhythm of the work was governed by natural cycles. In summer, the heat made clay dry too quickly, requiring frequent re-wetting and careful timing. Winter brought shorter days and longer hours spent by lamplight, straining eyes already weakened by years of close work. The rainy season created problems with humidity, causing tablets to crack or warp as they dried. Spring was the best time for writing, with moderate temperatures and stable conditions that made clay easy to work with. Meals in the scriptorium were simple and quick. Workers ate at their desks, careful not to get food on their tablets or tools. The diet was basic: bread, beer, onions, and occasionally a bit of meat or fish. The temple provided these meals as part of the scribe's compensation, but they were calculated to sustain life and work rather than provide pleasure. Eating was fuel for the body, nothing more. The social dynamics within the scriptorium were complex and often tense. Competition for advancement was fierce, with scribes constantly aware of their position in the hierarchy. Favoritism was common, with senior scribes often promoting students who reminded them of themselves or who came from influential families. Personal relationships could make or break a career, but they had to be navigated carefully. Too much ambition could mark you as a threat, while too little could condemn you to a lifetime of routine copying. Gossip was the unofficial currency of the scriptorium. Information about palace politics, trade disputes, and religious controversies filtered down through the ranks, often reaching the scribes before it became public knowledge. This information was valuable, but sharing it was dangerous. A scribe who repeated the wrong story to the wrong person could find himself dismissed or worse. The skill of listening carefully while appearing to hear nothing was essential for survival. The relationship between scribes and priests was complex and sometimes antagonistic. Priests needed scribes to maintain their records and correspondence, but they also viewed writing as a sacred art that should serve religious purposes. Scribes, for their part, often knew more about the practical workings of the temple than the priests themselves. This knowledge gave them a certain power, but it was a power that had to be exercised with extreme caution. Personal relationships outside the scriptorium were limited by the demands of the work. Most scribes married late, if at all, and their wives often came from other scribal families. Children of scribes were usually destined for the same profession, creating dynasties of literacy that passed skills and knowledge from generation to generation. Social life was restricted to other members of the literate class, creating a small, insular community within the larger society. The physical environment of the scriptorium was designed for function rather than comfort. Lighting was minimal, with only narrow windows and oil lamps to illuminate the work. Ventilation was poor, with the smell of clay, ink, and human bodies creating a close, stuffy atmosphere. The floor was hard-packed earth or stone, covered with simple reed mats. There was no decoration, no art, nothing to distract from the serious business of writing. Storage of completed tablets was a constant concern. The archives had to be organized in a way that made specific documents easy to find, but also protected them from damage. Tablets were stored on wooden shelves, arranged by type and date. A complex system of tags and labels helped identify specific documents, but even so, finding a particular tablet among thousands required considerable skill and patience. The oldest tablets were often moved to special storage areas where they were less likely to be disturbed. The preservation of written knowledge was seen as one of the most important responsibilities of the scribal class. Fire, flood, and warfare could destroy entire libraries in a matter of hours. Scribes were trained not just to create new documents, but to copy and preserve old ones. The most important texts were copied multiple times, with copies stored in different locations to ensure their survival. This preservation work was painstaking and often unrewarding, but it was essential for maintaining the continuity of civilization. And yet, for all the discomfort, your role mattered. Without scribes, the city could not function. Laws could not be enforced. Goods could not be tracked. Rituals could not be performed correctly. You were part of something bigger, even if the work felt small. The importance of literacy in Babylonian society cannot be overstated. In a world where most people could neither read nor write, scribes were the guardians of knowledge, the keepers of law, and the maintainers of order. They were the human links in a chain of communication that stretched from the king's palace to the humblest village temple. Without them, a complex administrative system that held the empire together would have collapsed within days. The power that came with literacy was both profound and subtle. A scribe could read the laws that governed society, understand the contracts that bound people together, and interpret the religious texts that promised salvation or damnation. This knowledge gave scribes influence far beyond their official status. They were consulted on legal matters, asked to witness important agreements, and sought out for their understanding of divine will. Yet this power came with corresponding responsibilities and dangers. A scribe who misused his knowledge could face severe punishment, including exile or death. The intellectual life of scribes extended beyond their professional duties. Many developed interests in mathematics, astronomy, literature, and philosophy. They gathered informally to discuss new ideas, debate interpretations of ancient texts, and share knowledge acquired through their work. These intellectual communities were small but vibrant, producing innovations in various fields of study. Some scribes became respected scholars, their opinions sought by kings and priests on matters of great importance. But still, the life of a scribe was one of constant strain, physically, mentally, and often spiritually. Pressure to be perfect, to keep records in divine order, made every day a quiet challenge. While others labored in fields or markets, you labored in silence, hunched over tablets, holding history in your hands one wedge-shaped symbol at a time. The spiritual dimension of scribal work was inescapable. Writing was believed to be a gift from the gods, particularly from Nabu, the deity of writing and wisdom. Every stylus was consecrated, every tablet blessed, every act of writing performed in the presence of the divine. This spiritual framework gave meaning to the work, but also added pressure. A mistake was not just a professional error, but a form of impiety, a failure to honor the gods who had granted the gift of literacy. The loneliness of the profession was profound. Scribes spent most of their working hours in silence, focused entirely on their individual tasks. The need for absolute concentration made casual conversation impossible. Even during breaks, the hierarchical structure of the scriptorium limited social interaction. Junior scribes did not speak casually with their superiors, and everyone was careful not to say anything that might be misinterpreted or repeated in the wrong context. The awareness of historical importance was both a burden and a comfort. Scribes knew that their work would outlast them, that the tablets they created would be read by people not yet born. This knowledge gave dignity to even the most routine tasks. A simple inventory of temple supplies might seem insignificant, but it was part of a permanent record that would help future generations understand their world. The weight of this responsibility was enormous, but it also provided a sense of purpose that transcended the daily difficulties of the work. The economic reality of scribal life was more complex than it appeared from the outside. While scribes were indeed privileged compared to farmers or laborers, their income was modest and their security uncertain. They depended entirely on the institutions that employed them, and changes in political or economic conditions could destroy their livelihoods overnight. The fall of a dynasty, the conquest of a city, or the decline of a temple could leave even the most skilled scribe without work. This uncertainty created a constant undercurrent of anxiety that affected every aspect of their lives. The health problems associated with scribal work were numerous and often severe. Beyond the obvious issues of eye strain and back pain, scribes suffered from a variety of ailments related to their sedentary lifestyle and poor working conditions. Respiratory problems were common, caused by dust from dried clay and smoke from oil lamps. Skin conditions affected the hands and forearms, caused by constant contact with clay and ink. Digestive problems were frequent, the result of irregular meal times and a diet heavy in bread and beer. The social isolation of scribes extended beyond their working hours. The demands of the profession left little time for normal social activities. They could not participate in seasonal festivals or community celebrations if important work was pending. Their knowledge of reading and writing set them apart from most of their neighbors, creating a barrier that was difficult to cross. Even within their own families, scribes often felt isolated, their work incomprehensible to relatives who lived in the world of physical labor and direct experience. The economic foundations of scribal work were built on a delicate balance of supply and demand. While literacy was rare, it was not rare enough to guarantee security. Too few scribes, and the administrative systems would collapse. Too many, and individual scribes would find themselves competing desperately for positions. The temples and palaces that employed scribes were constantly calculating their needs, hiring during busy seasons and dismissing workers when the workload diminished. This precarious employment situation meant that even skilled scribes lived with the constant fear of redundancy. Payment for scribal work varied dramatically depending on the nature of the assignment and the status of the employer. Routine copying work paid poorly, barely enough to maintain a modest standard of living. Specialized tasks, such as translating diplomatic correspondence or preparing legal documents, commanded higher fees. The most prestigious assignments, such as copying royal decrees or maintaining the archives of major temples, provided steady income and social recognition. However, these positions were few and highly competitive, often awarded based on political connections rather than skill alone. The career trajectory of a scribe was rarely linear. Most began with simple copying tasks, gradually working their way up to more complex assignments. However, advancement was often blocked by the limited number of senior positions available. A scribe might spend decades performing the same routine tasks, watching younger colleagues advance past them due to family connections or political favor. This created a class of bitter, experienced scribes who possessed great skill but little hope of advancement. The seasonal nature of much scribal work added another layer of uncertainty to their lives. Agricultural records were most intensive during planting and harvest seasons. Religious festivals required preparation weeks in advance, with ceremonial texts copied and recopied to ensure perfection. Tax collection periods brought waves of administrative work that required every available scribe. During quiet periods, many scribes found themselves without work, forced to seek temporary employment in other trades or rely on the charity of their families. The relationship between scribes and their tools was deeply personal and often superstitious. Each scribe developed preferences for particular types of reed, specific clay preparations, and individual working methods. These preferences were not mere habits, but were believed to influence the quality and spiritual power of the finished work. A scribe who lost his favorite stylus might spend days in anxiety, convinced that his work would suffer until a replacement could be properly consecrated. Some scribes kept collections of special tools, each reserved for specific types of work or important occasions. The mental demands of scribal work extended far beyond simple copying. A competent scribe needed to understand the context of everything he wrote. Legal documents required knowledge of law and precedent. Religious texts demanded familiarity with mythology and ritual. Administrative records needed understanding of mathematics and economics. This broad knowledge base had to be maintained and updated constantly. As laws changed, new religious practices emerged, and administrative procedures evolved. The pressure to maintain absolute accuracy created a unique form of psychological stress. Unlike other professions where mistakes could be corrected or covered up, scribal errors were permanent and often highly visible. A mistake in a public inscription could remain visible for centuries, a monument to the scribe's failure. This knowledge created a form of performance anxiety that affected every aspect of the work. Some scribes developed elaborate rituals to calm their nerves before beginning important tasks, while others suffered from physical symptoms such as trembling hands or stomach ailments. The intellectual isolation of scribes was as profound as their social isolation. While they possessed knowledge that set them apart from the general population, they often lacked opportunities to engage with intellectual equals. The hierarchical nature of the profession meant that junior scribes could not freely discuss ideas with their superiors, while senior scribes often viewed younger colleagues as competitors rather than collaborators. This created a stifling environment where intellectual growth was limited and innovation was discouraged. The preservation of ancient knowledge was one of the most important but least recognized aspects of scribal work. Many of the texts that scribes copied were hundreds of years old, written in archaic forms of cuneiform that required specialized knowledge to read. These preservation projects were time-consuming and often unrewarding, as the texts being copied were frequently obscure religious or legal documents that had little relevance to contemporary life. However, this work was essential for maintaining cultural continuity and ensuring that ancient wisdom was not lost. The regional variations in scribal practice added complexity to the profession. Different cities had different standards for document formatting, different preferences for clay preparation, and different traditions for organizing archives. A scribe who moved from one city to another often had to learn new techniques and adapt to different expectations. This lack of standardization made the profession more difficult, but also created opportunities for skilled scribes who could work in multiple traditions. The relationship between scribes and the broader literate class was complex and often competitive. While all literate individuals shared certain common experiences and knowledge, they were also rivals for limited opportunities. Scribes competed not only with each other, but with priests who could write, merchants who kept their own records, and court officials who prepared legal documents. This competition created a constant pressure to demonstrate superior skill and knowledge. The impact of political instability on scribal work was profound and often devastating. Wars could destroy entire archives, eliminating decades of careful work in a matter of hours. Changes in dynasty often meant changes in administrative procedures, making existing knowledge obsolete overnight. Foreign conquest could bring new languages and writing systems, forcing scribes to learn entirely new skills or face unemployment. The destruction of the library at Mari, with its thousands of tablets documenting centuries of diplomatic correspondence, was a catastrophe that affected scribes throughout the region. The daily routines of scribal work were governed by strict protocols designed to ensure quality and prevent errors. Each morning began with the preparation of clay and tools, a ritual that could take an hour or more. The workspace had to be arranged in a specific way, with tablets organized by priority and tools placed within easy reach. The first task of the day was always the most important, undertaken when the scribe's concentration was at its peak. Less critical work was reserved for later in the day, when fatigue might lead to minor errors. The social rituals surrounding scribal work were elaborate and meaningful. New scribes were inducted into the profession through ceremonies that emphasized their responsibilities and the sacred nature of their work. Senior scribes were honored with special titles and privileges that reflected their years of service. The death of a master scribe was marked by elaborate funeral rites that celebrated his contributions to the preservation of knowledge. These rituals helped create a sense of community and shared purpose among individuals who spent most of their working lives in isolation. The technical innovations in scribal work were gradual but significant. New types of clay were developed that dried more slowly, allowing for longer working sessions. Improved stylus designs made it possible to create finer, more precise marks. Better lighting systems reduced eye strain and made it possible to work longer hours. These innovations were usually developed by the scribes themselves, who had intimate knowledge of the challenges and limitations of their craft. The relationship between scribes and their families was often strained by the demands of the profession. The long hours and intense concentration required for scribal work left little time for family life. Children of scribes often felt neglected, while spouses struggled to understand work that seemed to consume their partner's entire existence. The social isolation that came with the profession extended to family members, who found themselves cut off from normal community life by their association with the scribal class. The apprenticeship system in scribal education was designed to create not just skilled workers, but dedicated servants of the written word. Young apprentices were taught that their craft was sacred, that every mark they made was a form of prayer, and that their work would outlast their lives. This indoctrination was effective, but also created psychological burdens that many scribes carried throughout their careers. The pressure to live up to these ideals was enormous, and the fear of failing to meet them was a constant source of anxiety. The archives maintained by scribes were among the most valuable possessions of any institution. These collections of tablets contained the accumulated wisdom and experience of generations. They were consulted for legal precedents, historical examples, and religious guidance. The scribes who maintained these archives were the guardians of civilization itself, responsible for preserving the knowledge that made complex society possible. This responsibility was both an honor and a burden, as the loss of important documents could have consequences that extended far beyond the individual scribe. The international nature of scribal work created opportunities for travel and cultural exchange, but also introduced new challenges and pressures. Scribes who worked on diplomatic correspondence had to understand not only multiple languages, but also the cultural contexts that gave meaning to formal communications. They needed to know which phrases would be interpreted as friendly, which might give offense, and how to convey complex political messages without creating misunderstandings. This work required a level of cultural sophistication that few scribes possessed. The technological limitations of clay tablet writing shaped every aspect of scribal work. Unlike papyrus or parchment, clay could not be easily corrected once it began to dry. This meant that scribes had to plan their work carefully, calculating how much text would fit on each tablet and how to arrange it for maximum clarity. The weight of clay tablets made them difficult to transport and store, limiting the size of archives and the scope of correspondence. These limitations forced scribes to develop techniques for compressing information and creating efficient organizational systems. The guild system that governed scribal work provided both protection and restriction. Guild membership offered certain benefits, including access to work opportunities, legal protection, and social support. However, it also imposed obligations and limitations that could be burdensome. Guild rules governed everything from training procedures to pricing standards, leaving little room for individual initiative or innovation. The tension between collective security and personal freedom was a constant source of conflict within the scribal community. Now that we've traced the careful strokes of the scribe's daily grind, let's step away from the ink-stained mat and into the presence of power. A king who carved his vision of justice into stone, a code meant to guide an empire, even if it did so with heavy hands. But before we can understand the weight of royal justice, we must first understand the streets where that justice would be dispensed. The markets where merchants argued over grain prices, the neighborhoods where families struggled to survive, the temples where priests interceded with gods who seemed increasingly distant. Let's move now into the world of Hammurabi, where the careful marks of scribes like you would soon record laws that would echo through millennia, transforming the silent labor of the scriptorium into the thunderous voice of imperial authority. The sun has risen high over Babylon, casting long, angular shadows along the polished stones of the palace courtyard. The air feels still and dry, and in the distance, the steady splash of water from a clay jug echoes faintly off the walls. In this world of dust-colored bricks and quiet ceremony, one man ruled with an unwavering sense of purpose. His name was Hammurabi. To many, he was more than just a king. He was a shepherd of the people, or so the inscriptions claimed, chosen by the gods to bring order to a world filled with disputes and uncertainty. But Hammurabi's idea of order was carved in stone, not whispered in kindness, and that stone still speaks today. The Code of Hammurabi, as we now call it, was not a book or a scroll. It was a monument, a black basalt stele, over 7 feet tall, inscribed with nearly 300 laws in tight, wedge-shaped cuneiform script. At the top, a carved image shows Hammurabi receiving authority from Shamash, the god of justice. Below that image, line after line of laws detail the rules of life, from the price of hiring an ox to the punishment for theft or false accusation. The very act of creating this stele was revolutionary. Before Hammurabi, laws existed in the minds of elders and the traditions of tribes. They were fluid, changeable, dependent on memory and interpretation. But here was something different. Here was permanence. The black stone itself was carefully chosen, quarried from distant mountains and transported to Babylon at enormous expense. The scribes who carved it worked for months, perhaps years, ensuring every wedge was precise, every line straight. This was not merely a legal document. It was a statement of power, a declaration that the king's word would outlast his mortal flesh. The code did not apply equally to everyone. Babylonian society was layered and hierarchical. The laws were different for nobles, commoners, and slaves. What was a fine for one man might be a death sentence for another. Still, the intention was clear. These laws were meant to settle disputes, control behavior, and bind a vast, diverse kingdom together under one framework. This stratification was not accidental, but carefully designed. The Oilum, or nobles, occupied the highest tier of society. They were landowners, merchants, and officials who served the king directly. Below them stood the Mushkinim, the common people who made up the bulk of Babylonian society. These were farmers, artisans, and small traders who owned property but lacked the political influence of the nobility. At the bottom were the wardum, the slaves, who were considered property themselves and had virtually no legal rights. The penalties reflected these divisions starkly. If a noble struck another noble, he might pay a fine of silver. If a commoner struck a noble, he could lose his hand. If a slave struck a noble, he might forfeit his life. Yet paradoxically, this system also offered a kind of protection. A noble who killed a commoner's slave had to compensate the owner, establishing that even slaves had some monetary value in the eyes of the law. It was harsh justice, but it was predictable justice. Imagine a city buzzing with disagreements. A farmer claims his neighbor stole a goat. A merchant accuses his assistant of shorting the scales. A builder finishes a house, and days later it collapses. Without consistent rules, every conflict could unravel into chaos. Hammurabi's laws gave structure to these moments. In return, the people gave loyalty to the one who made them. Consider the complexity of daily life in ancient Babylon. The city was a crossroads of trade, where merchants from distant lands brought goods and customs that could clash with local traditions. Akkadian speakers mingled with Sumerians, each group carrying their own sense of justice and fairness. Nomadic tribes settled alongside urban dwellers, creating friction over land use and water rights. Into this bubbling cauldron of potential conflict, Hammurabi introduced his code like a stabilizing force. The merchant quarter alone presented countless opportunities for dispute. Weights and measures varied from region to region, making trade disputes inevitable. A merchant from Mari might use different standards than one from Ur, leading to accusations of cheating. The code addressed this by establishing standard measures and severe punishments for those who used false weights. It mandated that all significant transactions be witnessed and recorded, creating a paper trail that could resolve disputes long after the original parties had forgotten the details. But the code was also strict, very strict. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That phrase comes directly from Hammurabi's world. If a man broke the bone of another, his own bone would be broken. If a builder's poor workmanship caused a house to fall and kill the owner's son, the builder's son might be put to death in turn. The goal was not only to punish, but to deter. Justice in this world was public and absolute. This principle of proportional punishment, known as lex talionis, was actually more merciful than what came before. In earlier times, a single offense might trigger a blood feud that could consume entire families for generations. A stolen sheep might lead to the massacre of a clan. Hammurabi's code placed limits on revenge, ensuring that the punishment matched the crime rather than exceeding it. The phrase eye for an eye was not a call for brutality, but a restraint on it. The public nature of these punishments served multiple purposes. When a thief's hand was cut off in the town square, it sent a clear message to potential criminals. But it also demonstrated the king's power to enforce his will. The people gathered to witness these spectacles saw not just the consequences of crime, but the authority of the state. The code became a performance, with each execution or mutilation serving as both deterrent and propaganda. Yet the code also recognized degrees of intent and circumstance. A man who killed in self-defense faced different consequences than one who murdered in cold blood. An accidental death during a fight was treated differently than a premeditated assassination. The code distinguished between theft committed out of desperation and theft committed out of greed. These nuances reveal a sophisticated understanding of human nature and motivation. There were laws about marriage and divorce, about property and inheritance, about the obligations of workers, and even about accusations of sorcery. No detail was considered too small. A tavern keeper who allowed conspirators to meet in her shop could be executed. A midwife who made an error could be fined or banished. Contracts had to be witnessed and sealed, debts repaid in kind, and accusations backed with evidence or oaths. The marriage laws reveal much about Babylonian society's values and concerns. Women had more rights than in many ancient cultures, but they were still largely subordinate to men. A woman could own property, run a business, and even serve as a witness in court. Yet a husband could divorce his wife by simply declaring his intent, while a wife seeking divorce had to prove serious wrongdoing. The code protected women from arbitrary abandonment by requiring divorced husbands to provide financial support, but it also punished adultery with death. The inheritance laws were particularly complex, reflecting the importance of family lineage in Babylonian society. Sons typically inherited their father's property, but daughters could inherit if there were no male heirs. Adopted children had rights equal to biological children, encouraging the practice of adoption as a way to ensure family continuity. The code even addressed the rights of children born to slave women, granting them potential freedom if their father acknowledged them. Professional regulations filled many sections of the code. Physicians faced severe penalties if their treatments caused harm. A surgeon who operated on a noble and caused death could lose his hands, effectively ending his career. Yet the same physician could charge higher fees for successful treatments, creating a risk-reward system that encouraged skilled practitioners while deterring quacks. Builders faced similar regulations, with shoddy construction leading to fines, exile, or death, depending on the consequences. The code's treatment of debt reveals the economic realities of ancient Babylon. Debt slavery was common, with people selling themselves or their children to pay off obligations. The code placed limits on this practice, requiring that debt slaves be freed after 3 years and prohibiting creditors from seizing certain essential property. These provisions suggest that debt had become a serious social problem, threatening the stability of the kingdom. Agricultural laws addressed the backbone of Babylonian society. Most people were farmers, and disputes over land, water, and crops were constant sources of conflict. The code established rules for irrigation, crop sharing, and animal husbandry. It protected farmers from dishonest shepherds, who might claim that wolves had killed sheep they had actually sold. It set standards for field maintenance and penalties for those who allowed their animals to damage neighbors' crops. The code's religious dimensions cannot be ignored. Ancient Babylonians saw law as divinely ordained, with Hammurabi serving as the earthly representative of cosmic justice. The carving at the top of the stele, showing Hammurabi receiving authority from Shamash, was not merely decorative, but theological. It established the king's legitimacy and placed his laws within the realm of sacred duty. To break the king's law was to offend the gods themselves. This religious framework gave the code moral authority that transcended political power. Even when Hammurabi's dynasty fell and other kings ruled Babylon, the code retained its influence. Later rulers adopted and adapted its principles, creating a legal tradition that would influence law codes throughout the ancient Near East. The Hebrew Bible's legal sections show clear influence from Hammurabi's code, as do the laws of the Hittites and Assyrians. It's easy to read the code now and see it only as harsh. But for its time, it was a major step forward. In earlier periods, justice was personal and inconsistent, often left to the whims of local leaders or clan loyalty. Hammurabi offered something more permanent. His laws did not rely on memory or interpretation. They were carved into stone, meant to last, visible for all who could read. The code's influence extended far beyond its original context. When archaeologists rediscovered the stele in 1901, they found it in Susa, hundreds of miles from Babylon. It had been carried there as war booty by Elamite raiders, yet even in captivity, it continued to influence legal thinking. The Elamites studied its provisions and incorporated some of its principles into their own legal system. This pattern of transmission and adaptation would continue throughout history. Of course, most people could not read them. That task, as you now know, fell to the scribes. They copied the code onto clay tablets, memorized its clauses, and explained its meaning to others. They acted as the voice of the law, delivering its commands from temple doors to village markets. And while the stone stele may have stood tall in the capital, it was these quiet scribes who brought its rules to life in the daily routine of Babylonian society. The scribes who administered the code were more than mere clerks. They were learned men who understood not just the literal meaning of the laws, but their underlying principles. They could adapt general rules to specific situations, interpret ambiguous language, and ensure that justice was served even in cases not explicitly covered by the code. Their training was rigorous, requiring years of study in reading, writing, mathematics, and legal precedent. These scribes operated from temples, palaces, and local administrative centers throughout the kingdom. They maintained records of legal proceedings, drafted contracts, and served as witnesses to important transactions. Their archives, preserved on thousands of clay tablets, provide invaluable insights into how the code functioned in practice. We can see cases where the law was applied strictly, and others where local circumstances led to modified penalties. The relationship between the written code and actual legal practice was complex. While the stele proclaimed absolute rules, the reality of enforcement was more nuanced. Local judges had discretion in applying penalties, and wealthy defendants could often negotiate reduced sentences. The code served as a framework rather than a rigid set of instructions, providing guidance while allowing for practical flexibility. Evidence from court records suggests that many disputes were resolved through negotiation rather than formal legal proceedings. The code's existence encouraged parties to settle their differences privately, knowing that the alternative might be harsh public punishment. This had the effect of reducing the burden on the court system, while maintaining social order through the threat of legal action. Even with the code in place, Babylon was not without corruption or conflict. Laws could be ignored, twisted, or selectively applied. But still, the presence of the code marked a turning point. It created expectations. It shaped how people understood fairness, responsibility, and authority. Its influence extended far beyond its time, echoing into later systems of justice and governance. The code's legacy can be traced through subsequent legal systems across the ancient world. The laws of Eshnunna, which may have predated Hammurabi's code, show similar principles but less sophisticated organization. The Middle Assyrian laws, created several centuries later, adopted many of Hammurabi's innovations while reflecting the different social conditions of Assyrian society. The Neo-Babylonian legal system, which flourished 1,000 years after Hammurabi, still showed clear influence from his code. Archaeological evidence suggests that the code remained influential long after the fall of Babylon. Copies have been found throughout Mesopotamia, often in contexts that suggest they were still being studied and referenced centuries after their creation. The persistence of this legal tradition speaks to the code's fundamental soundness and its ability to address universal human concerns about justice and social order. The code's impact on legal philosophy cannot be overstated. It established several principles that remain central to legal systems today. The concept of proportional punishment, the importance of evidence in legal proceedings, the need for witnesses in important transactions, and the idea that laws should be publicly known and consistently applied all trace their roots back to Hammurabi's innovations. Modern legal scholars continue to study the code not just as a historical curiosity, but as a foundational text in the development of legal thinking. Its combination of moral authority, practical flexibility, and systematic organization created a template that would influence legal systems for millennia. The code demonstrated that law could be both a tool of social control and a protection for individual rights, a balance that remains challenging to achieve. The social impact of the code extended beyond its legal provisions. By establishing clear rules for behavior, it helped create a more predictable social environment where people could plan for the future with greater confidence. Merchants knew the penalties for fraud, builders understood the consequences of shoddy work, and farmers could rely on protection for their crops. This predictability encouraged economic growth and social development. The code also reflected and reinforced social hierarchies while providing some protection for the disadvantaged. Slaves had few rights, but they had some. Women were subordinate to men, but they had legal recourse against abuse. The poor faced harsher penalties than the rich, but they also had access to the same legal system. These contradictions reveal the complexity of ancient Babylonian society and the challenges of creating laws that would satisfy different social groups. When you read its lines today, there is a strange stillness to them. They speak in flat, unyielding terms, but behind them you can sense the murmur of a complex world. A world where people argued and traded, hoped and feared, and looked to the law not just for punishment, but for protection. The language of the code itself is remarkable for its clarity and precision. Written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East, it uses formal legal terminology that leaves little room for ambiguity. Each law follows a similar structure. If a man does X, then Y shall happen to him. This formulaic approach made the code easy to memorize and apply, essential qualities in a largely oral culture. Yet beneath this formal language lies a wealth of detail about daily life in ancient Babylon. We learn about the different types of beer sold in taverns, the proper way to hire a boat, the fees charged by various craftsmen, and the complex relationships between landlords and tenants. The code serves as both a legal document and a social history, preserving insights into a civilization that vanished over 3,000 years ago. The code's epilogue reveals Hammurabi's own understanding of his achievement. He presents himself as a caring shepherd who has established justice for his people, protecting the weak from the strong and ensuring that the innocent are not wronged. This self-presentation was both genuine belief and political propaganda, reflecting the ancient Near Eastern concept of kingship as divine service. The physical stele itself became a symbol of justice that transcended its original context. Later rulers commissioned their own law codes, often copying Hammurabi's format and structure. The tradition of carving laws in stone spread throughout the ancient world, from the Hittite Empire to the Greek city-states. Even the Roman 12 tables, carved in bronze and displayed in the Forum, followed the precedent established by Hammurabi's stele. The discovery of the stele in 1901 created a sensation in the academic world. Here was concrete evidence of sophisticated legal thinking from one of humanity's earliest civilizations. The code challenged assumptions about the development of law and justice, demonstrating that complex legal systems existed thousands of years before the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. Comparison with other ancient law codes reveals both the universality of certain legal principles and the specific cultural context of Hammurabi's creation. The principle of proportional punishment appears in legal systems across the ancient world, suggesting that it addresses fundamental human concerns about fairness. Yet the specific penalties and social distinctions reflected in the code are uniquely Babylonian, shaped by the particular circumstances of Mesopotamian society. The code's treatment of women reveals the complexities of gender relations in ancient Babylon. Women could own property, engage in business, and serve as witnesses in court, rights that were denied to women in many other ancient societies. Yet they were also subject to male authority and faced severe penalties for adultery or disobedience. The code protected women from arbitrary divorce, while also reinforcing their subordinate status within marriage. The economic regulations in the code provide insights into the sophisticated commercial system of ancient Babylon. Rules about contracts, debts, and business partnerships reveal a society where trade was central to daily life. The code's provisions about interest rates, loan guarantees, and commercial partnerships show a level of economic sophistication that would not be out of place in a modern legal system. The code's influence on later legal development cannot be overstated. Its principles of proportional punishment, the importance of evidence, and the need for consistent application of laws became fundamental to legal systems throughout the ancient world. The Hebrew Bible's legal sections show clear influence from Hammurabi's code, as do the laws of the Hittites, Assyrians, and other ancient peoples. The administrative structure required to implement the code was impressive in its own right. The kingdom needed trained judges, skilled scribes, and efficient communication systems to ensure that the laws were known and enforced throughout the territory. The code's success depended not just on its written provisions, but on the bureaucratic apparatus that brought it to life. The code's theological dimensions deserve special attention. In the ancient Near East, law was not seen as a human creation, but as a divine gift. Kings were viewed as the earthly representatives of cosmic justice, responsible for maintaining the order established by the gods. This religious framework gave the code moral authority that transcended political power and helped ensure its continued influence even after Hammurabi's dynasty fell. The preservation of the code through multiple copies and translations demonstrates its enduring importance. Scribes continued to copy and study the text for over 1,000 years after its creation, adapting its principles to new circumstances while maintaining its essential structure. This process of transmission and adaptation helped spread Mesopotamian legal thinking throughout the ancient world. The code's legacy extends into the modern era through its influence on later legal systems and its continued study by scholars. Its combination of moral authority, practical flexibility, and systematic organization created a template that continues to influence legal thinking today. The principles it established remain central to contemporary discussions about justice, punishment, and the role of law in society. The practical mechanics of implementing the code reveal the sophisticated bureaucratic system that Hammurabi created. Beyond the scribes who copied and interpreted the laws, there were court officials who specialized in different types of cases. Some focused on commercial disputes, others on family matters, and still others on criminal proceedings. This specialization allowed for more informed decision-making and helped ensure that complex cases received appropriate attention. The court system itself was hierarchical, mirroring the social structure of Babylonian society. Local courts handled minor disputes and routine matters, while more serious cases were referred to regional centers. The most important cases, particularly those involving nobles or significant sums of money, might be heard directly by the king or his appointed judges. This system provided multiple levels of appeal and review, though the higher courts were accessible primarily to those with wealth or influence. Archaeological excavations have revealed the physical spaces where these legal proceedings took place. Court buildings were typically located near temples or administrative centers, emphasizing the connection between divine authority and earthly justice. The layout of these buildings suggests formal procedures, with designated areas for judges, witnesses, and the parties involved in disputes. Stone benches and raised platforms indicate that these proceedings were public events, witnessed by community members who could learn from the outcomes. The training of judges was a lengthy process that began in childhood. Boys selected for legal careers studied not only the code itself, but also rhetoric, mathematics, and the religious traditions that underpinned Babylonian law. They learned to read the subtle signs of deception, to weigh conflicting testimony, and to apply general principles to specific situations. The most skilled judges were respected figures in their communities, often serving as mediators and advisors even outside formal legal proceedings. The code's treatment of evidence reveals sophisticated understanding of proof and testimony. Different types of evidence carried different weights in legal proceedings. Physical evidence, such as stolen goods found in someone's possession, was considered highly reliable. Witness testimony was valued, but required multiple corroborating sources for serious accusations. Documentary evidence, in the form of contracts or official records, was particularly important for commercial disputes. The concept of the oath played a crucial role in Babylonian legal proceedings. When other forms of evidence were unavailable, parties might be required to swear before the gods that their testimony was true. This was not merely a formal requirement, but a deeply spiritual act that carried real consequences. False oaths were believed to bring divine punishment, and the fear of this supernatural retribution helped ensure truthful testimony. The code's provisions for legal procedures were remarkably detailed. It specified time limits for bringing accusations, requirements for notification of legal proceedings, and standards for the presentation of evidence. These procedural rules helped ensure fair trials and prevented the abuse of legal processes. They also created a predictable framework that allowed people to understand their rights and obligations within the legal system. The relationship between the code and local customs was complex and often contentious. While the code established kingdom-wide standards, local communities often had their own traditions and practices that conflicted with royal law. A code's administrators had to navigate these conflicts carefully, balancing the need for consistent application of the law with respect for local sensibilities. This balancing act required considerable diplomatic skill and deep understanding of regional differences. The code's influence on international relations was significant. As Babylon became a major power in the ancient Near East, its legal principles spread to other kingdoms through diplomatic contacts and commercial relationships. Treaties between Babylon and other states often incorporated elements of Hammurabi's legal thinking, creating a shared framework for international law. This legal diplomacy helped stabilize relations between different peoples and facilitated trade and cultural exchange. The economic impact of the code extended far beyond its specific commercial regulations. By creating a predictable legal environment, it encouraged investment and entrepreneurship. Merchants were more willing to extend credit when they knew that contracts would be enforced. Artisans could specialize in particular skills, knowing that their property rights would be protected. The code's stability helped Babylon become a major commercial center that attracted traders from across the known world. The code's treatment of family relationships reveals the complex social dynamics of ancient Babylonian society. While the basic family unit was patriarchal, with the father holding ultimate authority, the code also recognized the rights and responsibilities of other family members. Mothers had legal standing in matters involving their children, and older children had obligations to support their parents. These family laws helped maintain social cohesion and provided security for vulnerable members of society. The code's provisions for adoption were particularly progressive for their time. Adopted children enjoyed full legal rights and were expected to care for their adoptive parents in old age. This system provided security for childless couples while also caring for orphans and abandoned children. The legal framework for adoption was detailed and carefully regulated, ensuring that all parties understood their rights and obligations. The code's agricultural regulations reflect the central importance of farming in Babylonian society. Most of the population was engaged in agriculture, and disputes over land, water, and crops were constant sources of conflict. The code established clear rules for irrigation systems, crop sharing arrangements, and the responsibilities of landowners and tenants. These regulations helped maximize agricultural productivity while minimizing conflicts that could disrupt food production. The code's treatment of slavery, while harsh by modern standards, was actually relatively progressive for its time. Slaves had some legal protections and could even own property in certain circumstances. The code regulated the treatment of slaves and provided mechanisms for manumission. These provisions reflect the economic reality that slaves were valuable property that needed protection, but they also suggest some recognition of slaves' basic humanity. The code's influence on literary and cultural expression cannot be overlooked. The formal, declarative language of the laws influenced other types of writing, from royal inscriptions to religious texts. The code's emphasis on justice and divine authority became themes that appeared throughout Babylonian literature. Later writers would reference the code's principles when discussing moral and ethical issues, cementing its place in the cultural consciousness of the ancient world. The preservation and transmission of the code required a sophisticated system of education and record-keeping. Scribal schools throughout the kingdom taught the code's provisions as part of their standard curriculum. Students learned to recite key passages from memory and to apply the code's principles to hypothetical cases. This educational system ensured that knowledge of the law was widespread among the literate class and that legal traditions would be passed down to future generations. The code's treatment of medical practice reveals the advanced state of Babylonian medicine. Physicians were regulated professionals who faced serious consequences for malpractice. The code distinguished between different types of medical practitioners and established appropriate fees for various treatments. These regulations helped ensure that medical care was both accessible and of reasonable quality, while also protecting patients from incompetent or fraudulent practitioners. The code's provisions for construction and engineering reflect the technical sophistication of Babylonian society. Builders were held to high standards and faced severe penalties for faulty workmanship. The code established standards for different types of construction and specified the responsibilities of contractors, subcontractors, and property owners. These regulations helped ensure that buildings were safe and durable, contributing to the impressive architectural achievements of ancient Babylon. The code's treatment of maritime and river trade reveals the importance of waterways in ancient Mesopotamian commerce. The Euphrates and Tigris rivers were major highways for trade, and the code established detailed regulations for boat owners, cargo handlers, and river pilots. These maritime laws helped facilitate trade while protecting the interests of merchants and transporters. The code's provisions for salvage rights and river navigation. Disputes show the sophisticated understanding of commercial law that characterized Babylonian society. The code's influence on religious practice was profound but subtle. While the code did not directly regulate religious observance, it established the framework within which religious institutions operated. Temples were major landowners and commercial entities, and the code's provisions for property rights and business relationships affected their operations. The code also reinforced the divine nature of royal authority, strengthening the religious foundations of Babylonian society. The code's treatment of women's economic rights was complex and sometimes contradictory. While women were generally subordinate to male relatives, they could own property, engage in business, and participate in legal proceedings. The code protected women's property rights and provided mechanisms for women to seek redress for economic wrongs. These provisions reflect the important economic roles that women played in Babylonian society, even within a patriarchal framework. The code's psychological impact on Babylonian society was as important as its legal provisions. The mere existence of written, publicly displayed laws created a sense of order and predictability that helped reduce social anxiety. People knew what was expected of them and what consequences they would face for various actions. This psychological security helped create a stable social environment that encouraged economic growth and cultural development. The code's treatment of international law and diplomacy was pioneering for its time. The code established principles for dealing with foreign merchants, diplomatic immunity for ambassadors, and procedures for resolving disputes between different kingdoms. These international legal principles helped Babylon maintain peaceful relations with its neighbors and facilitated the growth of long-distance trade networks. The code's influence on military organization and conduct was significant. While primarily a civil law code, it included provisions that affected military service, the treatment of prisoners, and the conduct of warfare. These military regulations helped ensure that Babylon's armies were disciplined and effective, while also providing some protection for non-combatants. The code's emphasis on proportional punishment influenced military justice systems throughout the ancient world. The code's treatment of technology and innovation reveals the advanced state of Babylonian society. The code recognized intellectual property rights, protected trade secrets, and regulated the use of new technologies. These provisions encouraged innovation while also ensuring that new technologies were used safely and responsibly. The code's approach to technology regulation influenced later legal systems and helped establish principles that remain relevant today. The code's impact on urban planning and development was substantial. The code's provisions for property rights, building standards, and public works projects shaped the physical development of Babylonian cities. The code required that buildings meet certain standards, that streets be maintained, and that public spaces be accessible. These urban planning regulations helped create cities that were both functional and beautiful, contributing to the impressive architectural legacy of ancient Babylon. The seasonal rhythms of Babylonian life were reflected in the code's agricultural and commercial provisions. The code recognized that different rules might apply during planting season, harvest time, and the flood season. These seasonal variations in legal requirements show the code's practical flexibility and its creator's deep understanding of the natural cycles that governed ancient life. The code's ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining consistent principles was one of its greatest strengths. The code's treatment of education and literacy was forward-thinking for its time. While the code did not mandate universal education, it recognized the importance of literacy and protected the rights of scribes and teachers. The code established standards for educational institutions and regulated the fees that teachers could charge. These educational provisions helped ensure that knowledge and learning were preserved and transmitted to future generations. The intersection of the code with Babylonian astronomy and mathematics reveals another dimension of its sophistication. The precise calculations required for legal proceedings, from property surveys to commercial transactions, demanded advanced mathematical knowledge. The code's provisions for measuring land calculating interest rates and determining compensation required scribes who were skilled in complex arithmetic. This mathematical precision helped ensure fair outcomes and reduce disputes over calculations. The code's treatment of artisans and craftsmen illuminates the skilled labor that built Babylonian civilization. Each craft had its own regulations, from potters who had to guarantee their wares to jewelers who faced severe penalties for using inferior materials. The code recognized different levels of skill within crafts, with master craftsmen held to higher standards than apprentices. This system encouraged the development of expertise while protecting consumers from poor workmanship. The code's approach to mental illness and disability shows a surprisingly nuanced understanding of human capacity. While ancient societies often treated mental illness as divine punishment or demonic possession, the code distinguished between different types of incapacity and provided legal protections for those unable to represent themselves. These provisions suggest a more compassionate approach to human vulnerability than might be expected from such an ancient legal system. The seasonal courts that operated during religious festivals demonstrate the code's integration with Babylonian cultural life. During major festivals, special courts were established to handle the influx of visitors and the increased commercial activity. These festival courts operated under modified procedures that accommodated the temporary nature of many relationships and transactions. The code's flexibility in adapting to these special circumstances shows its practical wisdom. The code's treatment of environmental issues reveals early recognition of ecological concerns. Regulations governing the use of water resources, the disposal of waste, and the protection of agricultural land show an understanding that individual actions could have broader consequences. The code prohibited activities that might pollute water sources or damage communal grazing areas, establishing some of the earliest environmental protection laws in human history. The role of women as witnesses in legal proceedings was more complex than the code's basic provisions suggest. While women generally had fewer legal rights than men, they could serve as witnesses in certain types of cases, particularly those involving other women or domestic matters. This gendered approach to testimony reflects the separate spheres that men and women occupied in Babylonian society, but it also recognized that women had unique knowledge and perspectives that were valuable in legal proceedings. The code's provisions for the treatment of animals reflect both practical concerns and religious beliefs. Animals were valuable property that needed protection, but they were also beings with their own place in the divine order. The code regulated the care of domestic animals, the responsibilities of shepherds and herders, and the procedures for dealing with dangerous animals. These animal welfare provisions suggest a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between humans and animals than might be expected from such an ancient society. The code's treatment of bankruptcy and debt forgiveness shows remarkable foresight about economic cycles. The code recognized that economic downturns could leave even honest people unable to pay their debts, and it provided mechanisms for debt relief that prevented the complete collapse of individual fortunes. These provisions helped maintain social stability during difficult economic periods and encouraged risk-taking that could benefit the broader economy. The code's influence on architectural standards extended beyond basic building requirements to include aesthetic considerations. The code established standards for the appearance of buildings in important areas of the city, ensuring that public spaces maintained an appropriate level of dignity and beauty. These architectural regulations helped create the impressive urban landscapes that characterized Babylonian cities and influenced architectural development throughout the ancient world. The code's treatment of inheritance disputes reveals the complex family dynamics of Babylonian society. Extended families often included multiple wives, numerous children, and various dependents, creating potential conflicts over inheritance rights. The code provided detailed procedures for resolving these disputes, including provisions for posthumous adoption and the recognition of children born to concubines. These inheritance regulations helped maintain family stability and prevented the fragmentation of property that could weaken economic productivity. Code's approach to international commerce was pioneering in its recognition of different legal systems and commercial practices. The code established procedures for dealing with foreign merchants, including provisions for currency exchange, dispute resolution, and the enforcement of contracts across political boundaries. These international commercial regulations helped Babylon become a major center of long-distance trade and cultural exchange. The code's treatment of public health issues shows early recognition of collective welfare concerns. Regulations governing the storage and sale of food, the maintenance of public spaces, and the prevention of disease transmission demonstrate an understanding that individual health was connected to community well-being. These public health provisions helped maintain the dense urban populations that characterized Babylonian cities. The code's provisions for the resolution of boundary disputes reflect the importance of accurate land surveying in Babylonian society. The code required that property boundaries be clearly marked and regularly maintained, and it established procedures for resolving conflicts when boundaries were unclear. These surveying regulations helped prevent conflicts over land use and ensured that property rights were clearly defined and enforceable. The code's treatment of religious obligations shows the integration of spiritual and legal authority in Babylonian society. While the code did not directly regulate religious practice, it established the framework within which religious institutions operated and protected the rights of religious personnel. The code's recognition of temple property rights and religious festivals helped maintain the spiritual foundations of Babylonian civilization. The code's influence on literary composition is evident in the formal, declarative style that characterized later Mesopotamian writing. The code's clear, logical structure and its use of conditional statements influenced the development of legal writing throughout the ancient world. This literary influence helped establish conventions for legal documents that remain recognizable in modern legal systems. The code's treatment of consumer protection was remarkably advanced for its time. The code established standards for weights and measures, regulated the quality of goods sold in markets, and provided remedies for consumers who were cheated or deceived. These consumer protection provisions helped maintain confidence in commercial transactions and encouraged the development of specialized markets and skilled craftsmen. Now, as we leave behind the courtroom and the carved basalt, we turn our gaze upward, to the sky, to a structure that has stirred imaginations for thousands of years. A tower said to reach the heavens. Was it ever real? Did its bricks lie somewhere beneath the ruins? Let's follow the trail of ancient myth and modern archaeology and explore the quiet mystery of the Tower of Babel. In the same dusty landscape where Hammurabi's laws once governed the daily lives of thousands, another story took shape. A story of ambition and divine intervention, of human pride and cosmic punishment. A story that would echo through millennia, inspiring fear and wonder in equal measure. The trail begins not with carved stone or royal proclamation, but with whispered tales and half-remembered legends, leading us deeper into the heart of ancient Babylon's most enduring mystery. Look up. The sky above Babylon was wide and blue, streaked in summer with clouds that stretched like faded linen across the heat. Somewhere in that sky, legend says, a tower once climbed high enough to brush the edge of heaven. Its story has been passed down in scripture, whispered in temple hymns, and debated by scholars and archaeologists alike. But what was the Tower of Babel, really? And what does its silence tell us? The story begins with a myth. According to ancient texts, humanity once spoke a single language. United in speech and purpose, people gathered in a plain called Shinar and began to build a city with a tower that would reach the sky. It was meant to make a name for themselves, to prevent their scattering. But the divine response was not approval. Instead, the builders were confused. Their speech was divided. The city was abandoned, and its name became Babel, a word tied to confusion and the undoing of human ambition. The tale itself carries weight beyond its simple narrative. In the Hebrew Bible, the story serves as more than historical account. It becomes a meditation on human nature, divine authority, and the consequences of overreach. The word Babel derives from the Akkadian Babeli, meaning gate of God, yet the biblical narrative transforms this into a play on the Hebrew word balal, meaning to confuse or to mix. This linguistic wordplay reveals something profound about how stories evolve across cultures, how meaning shifts and transforms as tales travel from one civilization to another. The biblical account appears in Genesis, positioned strategically after the flood narrative and before the calling of Abraham. In this placement, the Tower of Babel represents humanity's first great collective endeavor after the world's renewal, and its failure becomes the explanation for the diversity of languages and the scattering of peoples across the earth. The story suggests that humanity's unity of purpose, when directed towards self-glorification rather than divine service, inevitably leads to confusion and division. Yet the narrative raises as many questions as it answers. Why would a divine being fear human achievement? What threat could mortal builders pose to the heavens? The text itself provides hints. Now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. The concern appears not to be about the physical height of the tower, but about the unlimited potential of unified human ambition. The confusion of languages becomes not merely punishment, but perhaps protection, a way of ensuring that humanity's reach does not exceed its wisdom. This theme of ambitious construction echoes through other ancient literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, predating the biblical account by centuries, tells of mighty building projects and the tension between human achievement and divine approval. In the Mesopotamian context, tower building was not hubris, but devotion. The ziggurats that dotted the landscape were expressions of religious fervor, attempts to create meeting places between earth and heaven. The disconnect between these cultural contexts and the biblical narrative suggests that the Tower of Babel story may have originated as a way to explain the imposing ruins that later peoples encountered in Mesopotamia. But behind the myth may lie a structure that was very real. In the center of ancient Babylon stood a massive ziggurat, a tiered temple tower built of mud brick and bitumen. These were not towers in the modern sense. They were solid, step-like platforms rising layer upon layer, each one smaller than the last. At the top, a small shrine likely housed a statue or symbol of the city's patron god. For Babylon, that god was Marduk. The ziggurat form itself represented a profound architectural and religious innovation. Unlike the pyramids of Egypt, which were primarily tombs, ziggurats were functioning temples, designed to bring the divine closer to the human realm. Their step structure was deeply symbolic. Each level represented a stage in the journey from earth to heaven, from the mundane to the sacred. The ascent was both physical and spiritual, a carefully choreographed movement that transformed the climber from supplicant to one who stood in proximity to the divine. The construction of these monuments required not just massive labor, but sophisticated engineering. The core was typically built of sun-dried bricks, cheaper and more readily available than fired brick. But the exterior was often faced with kiln-baked bricks that could withstand the elements. Between the layers, builders inserted mats of woven reeds, creating a kind of ancient rebar that helped distribute weight and prevent cracking. The bitumen mentioned in the biblical account was indeed used as mortar, a natural petroleum product that provided both adhesive and waterproofing properties. The ziggurat of Babylon had a name, Etamananki. Translated, it meant the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. According to ancient records, it stood over 90 meters high, though time and erosion have worn away much of its certainty. What we do know is that it dominated the city's sacred district. Its base measured about 91 meters on each side, a square of baked brick and carefully measured proportions. At its height, it would have been visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. The name itself reveals the builder's intentions. Etemenanke was not merely a tower, but a cosmic axis, a point where the divine and human realms intersected. The phrase foundation of heaven and earth suggests that the structure was conceived as literally foundational to the universe itself. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the gods required earthly residences, and the ziggurat provided the most magnificent dwelling possible, one that participated in both terrestrial and celestial realms. The ancient records that mention Etemenanke come from various sources. The Babylonian Chronicle, cuneiform tablets from the Neo-Babylonian period, and various royal inscriptions all reference the tower. One of the most detailed descriptions comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Babylon in the 5th century BCE and described the ziggurat as having 8 levels. However, archaeological evidence suggests 7 levels were more likely, and scholars debate whether Herodotus accurately observed the structure or relied on second-hand accounts. The dimensions mentioned in ancient sources are remarkably consistent. The base measurement of roughly 91 meters appears in multiple records, suggesting a standardized unit of measurement that may have been specific to sacred architecture. The height, while more variable in the sources, consistently describes a structure that would have been the tallest building in the known world at its time of completion. To put this in perspective, the entire structure would have been roughly the height of a modern 30-story building, an extraordinary achievement for the ancient world. The sacred district surrounding Etemenanke was itself a marvel. Known as the Isogila complex, it included not only the ziggurat, but also the main temple of Marduk, numerous smaller shrines, administrative buildings, and quarters for the priests. The entire area was enclosed by walls and gates, creating a city within a city, a sacred precinct that served as the religious heart of the Babylonian Empire. Pilgrims would have approached through carefully designed processional ways, their journey to the tower beginning long before they reached its base. Climbing, it was not a casual endeavor. Long, sloping stairways wrapped around its sides, leading pilgrims, priests, and officials upward through the structure's terraced levels. Along the way, they may have passed carved inscriptions, sacred niches, or resting spots. And at the summit, the shrine glowed with polished stone and offerings, a place thought to be close to the divine. The ascent was carefully choreographed. Unlike modern staircases, which are designed for efficiency, the stairways of Etemenanke were designed for transformation. The climb was meant to be meditative, a gradual separation from the earthly realm below. Each level had its own character and purpose. The lower levels were broader, more public, accessible to merchants and common citizens during festivals. The middle levels were more restricted, reserved for initiates and those with specific religious roles. The upper levels were the domain of the highest priests, and occasionally the king himself. Along the way, climbers would encounter various artistic and architectural elements. Glazed brick reliefs depicted mythological scenes, particularly episodes from the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, in which Marduk defeats the chaos monster Tiamat and establishes order in the universe. These images serve both as decoration and instruction, reminding climbers of the cosmic significance of the structure they were ascending. The niches mentioned in the ancient descriptions may have held smaller statues or votive offerings. These were likely places where individual pilgrims could leave personal dedications, creating a connection between their private devotions and the grand public ritual of the ziggurat. The resting spots were not mere conveniences, but integral parts of the ascending ritual, places where climbers could pause, pray, and prepare for the next stage of their journey. The shrine at the summit was the culmination of the entire experience. Ancient sources describe it as lavishly decorated, with walls covered in gold and precious stones. The central statue of Marduk was said to be made of solid gold, though this may have been hyperbolic. More likely, the statue was made of wood or clay and covered with gold leaf, a common technique in ancient monumental sculpture. The shrine also contained a sacred bed where the god was believed to rest and an altar for offerings. The offerings themselves were spectacular. Ancient records describe daily provisions of bread, beer, wine, oil, and incense. During major festivals, the offerings might include rare spices, precious metals, and even exotic animals. The smoke from the incense burners would have been visible from the ground, creating a constant reminder of the divine presence above. At night, the shrine was lit with oil lamps, making the tower's summit glow like a beacon across the city. Construction of Itemenanki likely began under earlier dynasty, but reached full scale during the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar II, centuries after Hammurabi. He wrote of the tower in inscriptions, boasting that he had completed what previous kings had only begun. But even for him, the tower was not eternal. Time, weather, war, and neglect all took their toll. Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from 605 to 562 BCE, was perhaps the most ambitious builder in Mesopotamian history. His inscriptions, discovered on bricks and stone tablets throughout Babylon, reveal a ruler obsessed with architectural legacy. The Tower of Babel was only one of his projects. He also built the famous Hanging Gardens, expanded the royal palace, and constructed the massive Ishtar Gate, portions of which can still be seen in museums today. His inscriptions about Itemenanki are particularly revealing. In one, he writes, "I mobilized all countries everywhere, each and every ruler who had been raised to prominence over all the people of the world, from the upper sea to the lower sea, those who are seated in throne rooms, those who live in other types of buildings, as well as all the kings of the Westland who live in tents." This passage suggests that the tower's construction was not merely a local project, but an international endeavor, with tributary kingdoms contributing labor and materials. The inscription continues, "I laid the foundation of Itemenanki down to the groundwater level with gold, silver, precious stones from the mountains and the sea, aromatics, cedar logs, and I completed its construction with baked brick and blue-colored glazed brick." The mention of groundwater level is significant, as it indicates that the builders dug deep foundations to ensure the massive structure's stability. The use of precious materials in the foundations, where they would never be seen, demonstrates the sacred nature of the project. The international scope of the construction also provides an interesting parallel to the biblical account. The story of Babel mentions that people came from the east and gathered in the plain of Shinar. While the biblical narrative treats this as the spontaneous migration of humanity, the historical reality may have been the organized conscription of labor from throughout the Babylonian Empire. The confusion of languages, described in the biblical account, might reflect the practical challenges of coordinating workers who spoke different languages and came from different cultural backgrounds. The construction process itself was extraordinary. Modern estimates suggest that the completed tower would have required approximately 36 million bricks. Each brick had to be made from local clay, shaped in wooden molds, dried in the sun, and then, for the facing bricks, fired in kilns. The bitumen mortar had to be transported from natural seeps in the region, a process that would have required extensive logistics and planning. The labor force was immense. Skilled craftsmen designed and supervised the construction, but the bulk of the work was done by conscripted laborers from throughout the empire. These workers came from diverse backgrounds: Babylonians, Assyrians, Elamites, Phoenicians, and many others. They lived in temporary camps around the construction site, creating a cosmopolitan community unlike anything seen in the ancient world. The engineering challenges were also substantial. The weight of the structure required careful calculation to prevent collapse. The builders used a technique called relieving arches to distribute the weight of the upper levels. They also incorporated drainage systems to prevent water damage, a crucial consideration in a region prone to flooding. The exterior was designed to withstand not only the elements, but also the thermal expansion and contraction that would occur with temperature changes. Yet for all its grandeur, the tower was vulnerable. The same materials that made it possible also made it fragile. Sun-dried brick, while economical, was susceptible to water damage. The bitumen mortar, while waterproof, became brittle with age. The sheer size of the structure meant that even small structural problems could cascade into major failures. The political context of the tower's construction also made it vulnerable. Babylon was constantly under threat from neighboring empires, and the resources devoted to monumental construction were resources not available for military defense. The tower, while symbolically important, was also a symbol of the empire's priorities, and those priorities sometimes conflicted with practical necessities. By the time Alexander the Great reached Babylon in the 4th century BCE, the tower was in ruins. He ordered it cleared with the intention of rebuilding, but that plan was never fulfilled. Over time, the bricks were scavenged, the structure collapsed, and only faint outlines remained in the soil. Alexander's encounter with the ruins of Etemenanki is one of the most poignant moments in ancient history. The young conqueror, who had already been compared to gods and who sought to surpass all previous achievements, found himself confronting the ultimate futility of earthly ambition. The tower that had once symbolized divine connection and human achievement was now a pile of rubble, its bricks scattered and its purpose forgotten. The Greek historians who accompanied Alexander provide some of the most detailed descriptions of the tower's ruins. Arrian writes that Alexander found the place occupied by a great mound of earth and debris. Strabo describes the site as a pyramid of baked brick that had been destroyed by time and neglect. These accounts suggest that even in ruin, the tower retained its impressive scale. Alexander's intention to rebuild the tower was not merely megalomaniacal, but reflected his broader policy of respecting and restoring local traditions. Throughout his conquests, he had made efforts to incorporate local customs and religious practices into his empire. The restoration of Etemenanki would have been a powerful symbol of continuity and respect for Babylonian culture. However, the practical challenges of the restoration were enormous. The original construction had taken decades and required resources from throughout the Babylonian Empire. Alexander's empire, while vast, was stretched thin, and the loyalty of his troops was already being tested by the distance from home and the unfamiliarity of Eastern customs. The cost of restoration would have been staggering, and the benefits, while symbolically significant, would have been difficult to justify to his pragmatic generals. The project was ultimately abandoned after Alexander's death in 323 BCE. His successors, the Seleucid kings, were more interested in building new Greek-style cities than in restoring ancient Mesopotamian monuments. The site of Etemenanki became a convenient source of building materials for other projects, and the systematic dismantling of the tower began. This process of scavenging was not unique to Babylon. Throughout the ancient world, monumental structures were regularly recycled when they fell into disuse. The stones of the Pharos of Alexandria were used to build medieval fortifications. The marble of the Colosseum was quarried for Renaissance palaces. The bricks of Etemenanki were used to build houses, walls, and other structures throughout Babylon and the surrounding region. The irony is palpable. The tower that had been built to make a name for its builders, to prevent their scattering, ultimately became scattered itself. Its bricks were dispersed throughout the region, incorporated into countless humble structures. The monument to human unity became the material for human diversity. Its grand purpose transformed into 1,000 small utilities. In the centuries that followed, travelers and chroniclers spoke of the tower as a wonder lost. Some confused it with other ruins. Others imagined it taller, grander, more mystical than it ever truly was. And in the biblical tradition, its fall became a symbol of divine limitation, a warning against pride. The medieval period saw a flowering of legends about the Tower of Babel. Islamic writers, building on both biblical and local traditions, created elaborate stories about the tower's construction and destruction. Some described it as having been built by the biblical Nimrod, who challenged God to single combat. Others claimed it had been destroyed by divine fire or earthquakes. These stories, while historically inaccurate, revealed the continued fascination with the tower's symbolic power. European travelers to the region in the medieval and early modern periods often claimed to have seen the tower's ruins, though their descriptions rarely matched the archaeological reality. Some identified it with the ruins of Borsippa, another ancient city with a ziggurat. Others claimed to have seen it at Babylon itself, though by their time, the actual remains were barely visible above ground level. The confusion was partly due to the landscape itself. The Mesopotamian plain is dotted with tells, artificial mounds created by centuries of human habitation. Many of these tells contain the ruins of ancient buildings, and to the untrained eye, any large mound might have been the Tower of Babel. The lack of visible structural remains made identification difficult, and the prestige associated with having seen the biblical tower encouraged exaggeration and misidentification. The symbolic power of the tower also influenced how it was remembered. Writers and artists depicted it not as it was, but as it ought to have been, given its legendary status. Medieval illuminated manuscripts show the tower as a European-style castle tower, impossibly tall and narrow. Renaissance paintings depict it as a classical column or a Gothic cathedral spire. Each culture reimagined the tower in its own architectural vocabulary, creating a visual tradition that was entirely divorced from historical reality. The Protestant Reformation brought new interest in the Tower of Babel story. Protestant theologians, seeking to distance themselves from Catholic emphasis on grand church architecture, used the tower as a symbol of the dangers of religious ostentation. The tower became a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of wealth and power on religious institutions. This interpretation influenced how the tower was depicted in Protestant art and literature, emphasizing its destructive aspects rather than its ambitious grandeur. The Enlightenment brought a more skeptical approach to the tower's story. Voltaire and other philosophers used the tale as an example of the irrationality of biblical narratives. They questioned whether such a structure could have been built with ancient technology, and whether the story of language, confusion made logical sense. This skepticism, while intellectually valuable, also contributed to a dismissal of the tower's historical significance. Modern archaeology has tried to separate the myth from the mud. Excavations at Babylon have uncovered the foundation of Etymonauki, confirming the size and orientation described in ancient texts. A plaque found near the site even shows a drawing of the ziggurat, tiered and symmetrical, rising steadily upward. But no inscription names it as the Tower of Babel. That connection, while compelling, remains partly rooted in story. The archaeological investigation of ancient Babylon began in earnest in the 19th century. German archaeologist Robert Koldewey led the most systematic excavations, working at the site from 1899 to 1917. His team uncovered the foundations of Etymonauki, confirming many of the details found in ancient texts. They also discovered the Esagila temple complex, the Ishtar Gate, and portions of the Hanging Gardens. Koldewey's work was meticulous by the standards of his time. He carefully mapped the foundations, recorded the dimensions, and collected samples of the building materials. His team also discovered numerous cuneiform tablets that provided additional information about the tower's construction and religious significance. However, the excavations were also limited by the technology and methods available at the time. The plaque mentioned in the archaeological record is particularly significant. Known as the Esagila tablet, it contains a detailed description of the temple complex, including a schematic drawing of the ziggurat. The tablet dates from the Seleucid period, long after the tower's destruction, but it appears to be copied from earlier sources. The drawing shows a seven-tiered structure, confirming the archaeological evidence and contradicting some of the classical accounts that described 8 levels. The tablet also provides precise measurements for each level of the ziggurat. The first level was 91 meters on each side. The second level was 78 meters, and so on, with each level being progressively smaller. The total height, according to the tablet, was 91 meters, matching the width of the base. This 1-to-1 ratio of height to base width was apparently a deliberate design choice, creating a structure that was both monumental and proportionally harmonious. However, the archaeological evidence also reveals the limitations of ancient record keeping. The measurements in the tablet are given in Babylonian units, which must be converted to modern equivalents. The conversion is complicated by the fact that Babylonian units varied over time and between different types of construction. The measurements are also idealized, representing the design intentions rather than the actual built dimensions, which would have varied due to construction tolerances and settlement. The foundation excavations revealed sophisticated engineering. The builders had dug down to the water table, ensuring a stable base for the massive structure. They had also incorporated drainage systems to prevent water damage and expansion joints to accommodate thermal movement. The quality of the brickwork was exceptionally high, with precisely fitted joints and consistent mortar thickness. Yet the archaeological evidence also confirms the tower's ultimate fate. The upper levels of the foundation show signs of systematic dismantling rather than natural collapse. The bricks were carefully removed, with valuable fired bricks being salvaged and cheaper sun-dried bricks being left behind. This pattern of selective salvage explains why so little of the original structure survived into the modern period. The excavations also revealed the human cost of the tower's construction. Beneath the foundation, archaeologists found the remains of workers who had died during construction. Some showed signs of crushing injuries, suggesting accidents during the building process. Others appeared to have died from disease or exhaustion. These grim discoveries provide a sobering counterpoint to the tower's symbolic grandeur. Modern geophysical surveys have revealed additional details about the tower's construction. Ground-penetrating radar has identified the locations of internal chambers and stairways within the foundation. Magnetic surveys have detected the presence of fired brick structures that are not visible on the surface. These non-invasive techniques have provided new information about the tower's internal structure without requiring destructive excavation. The connection between Etemenanke and the biblical Tower of Babel remains a subject of scholarly debate. The circumstantial evidence is strong. The location matches the biblical description. The scale is appropriate for the legendary tower, and the ultimate fate of abandonment and ruin fits the biblical narrative. However, no contemporary inscription explicitly identifies Etemenanke as the Tower of Babel, and the biblical account may be a composite of multiple Mesopotamian traditions. The linguistic evidence is also ambiguous. While the biblical etymology of Babel, as confusion, is clearly a Hebrew wordplay, the Akkadian Babili, meaning gate of God, is a more plausible original meaning. The transformation of the name from gate of God to confusion reflects the biblical author's reinterpretation of Mesopotamian traditions for Hebrew audiences. The archaeological evidence also raises questions about the timeline of the biblical narrative. The Tower of Babel story is placed in the primordial period, shortly after the flood and before the patriarchs. However, the historical Etemenanke was built much later, during the Neo-Babylonian period. This chronological mismatch suggests that the biblical story may be an etiological legend, a story created to explain the origins of linguistic diversity rather than a historical account of a specific building project. And yet, there is something haunting about the ruins, not because of what they are, but because of what they once were. A pile of bricks can become a symbol. A story passed from tongue to tongue can give shape to memory, even as the building itself fades. The power of the Tower of Babel story lies not in its historical accuracy, but in its enduring relevance. Every generation finds new meaning in the tale of ambitious builders and divine intervention. In the modern period, the story has been interpreted as a parable about technological hubris, a warning about the dangers of globalization, or a metaphor for the complexity of human communication. The image of the tower has become one of the most recognizable symbols in Western culture. It appears in countless works of art, literature, and popular culture. Painters like Peter Bruegel the Elder created iconic depictions of the tower's construction. Writers like Jorge Luis Borges used the tower as a metaphor for the infinite complexity of human knowledge. Filmmakers have used tower imagery to represent everything from corporate ambition to alien invasion. The tower's symbolic power extends beyond Western culture. In Islamic tradition, the tower represents the futility of opposing divine will. In Jewish mysticism, it symbolizes the importance of humility in the face of cosmic forces. In secular contexts, it has become a symbol of both human ambition and human limitation, a reminder that even the greatest achievements are temporary. The ruins themselves continue to inspire contemplation. Standing at the site of ancient Babylon, surrounded by the flat expanse of the Mesopotamian plain, visitors can still sense the grandeur of what once stood there. The scattered bricks and eroded foundations speak of human ambition and divine mystery in equal measure. The silence is profound, not empty, but full of echoes from the past. The landscape around the ruins has changed dramatically since ancient times. The Euphrates River has shifted its course, and the fertile plain that once supported a great city has become semi-arid. Modern highways and power lines cross the site, and the nearby town of Hilla has grown to encompass parts of the ancient city. Yet the essential character of the place remains unchanged. It is still a meeting point between earth and sky, still a place where human ambition confronts infinite mystery. The continuing fascination with the Tower of Babel reflects something fundamental about human nature. We are builders, creators, dreamers of impossible dreams. We reach for the sky not because we believe we can grasp it, but because reaching itself has meaning. The tower represents both the nobility and the futility of human ambition, the eternal tension between aspiration and limitation. In our own time, we build towers that dwarf ancient Babylon. Our skyscrapers reach higher than any ziggurat. Our space programs literally touch the heavens. Yet we continue to tell the story of Babel, perhaps because we recognize that height alone is not the measure of human achievement. The tower's true significance lies not in its physical dimensions, but in its symbolic resonance, its ability to represent the complex relationship between human ambition and divine mystery. Today, the site lies quiet. The remains are low, scattered, and worn smooth by centuries of wind. But in your mind, you might still see it rising, not in arrogance, but in reverence, not in defiance, but in hope. A tower not to conquer heaven, but to draw nearer to it. The quietude of the site is itself meaningful. In a world of constant noise and motion, the ruins offer a space for reflection. The absence of the tower becomes as powerful as its presence once was. What remains is not the building itself, but the questions it raises. What does it mean to build? What does it mean to reach beyond ourselves? What does it mean to leave a mark on the world? These questions find their answers not in the stones themselves, but in the stories we tell about them. The Tower of Babel continues to live because it speaks to something eternal in human experience. We are all builders of towers, whether literal or metaphorical. We all reach towards something beyond our immediate grasp, and we all face the possibility that our greatest achievements may ultimately return to dust. Yet there is something hopeful in the tower's story as well. Though the building fell, the impulse that created it survives. Though the languages were confused, the human desire for connection and meaning persists. Though the tower was scattered, the human spirit that built it continues to reach toward the heavens in new forms and new ways. The story of the Tower of Babel is ultimately a story about us. It reflects our deepest fears and our highest aspirations. It reminds us that we are capable of great things, But it also reminds us that we are not gods. It suggests that our greatest achievements may be temporary, but it also suggests that the impulse to achieve is itself eternal. As the sun sets over the ruins of ancient Babylon, casting long shadows across the remnants of Etemenanke, the tower lives on in memory and imagination. It stands as a monument not to what was, but to what might be. It reminds us that every ending is also a beginning, every ruin a foundation for something new. The relationship between the Tower of Babel and the broader constellation of Mesopotamian ziggurats reveals fascinating patterns of cultural transmission and architectural evolution. While Etemenanke was the most famous and perhaps the largest, it was not alone in the landscape. The ziggurat at Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nanna, predated Babylon's tower by centuries and established many of the architectural conventions that would later be perfected at Etemenanke. The tower at Borsippa, dedicated to the god Nabu, was constructed as a companion to Etemenanke and shared many of its design features. These structures formed a network of sacred architecture that connected the major cities of Mesopotamia in a web of religious and political significance. The seasonal cycles of ancient Babylon were intimately connected to the tower's ritual functions. During the spring festival of Akichu, which celebrated the new year and the renewal of Marduk's kingship, the tower became the focal point of elaborate ceremonies that could last for days. Processions would wind through the city streets, carrying the statue of Marduk from the Ezegila temple to a special shrine outside the city walls, and then back again. The tower served as a beacon during these processions, its summit visible from great distances and serving as a landmark for pilgrims approaching the city. The economic implications of the tower's construction were staggering and reveal much about the priorities of ancient Mesopotamian society. The resources devoted to Etemenanke could have funded entire military campaigns or fed the city's population for months. Yet the decision to build was not merely about religious devotion, but about demonstrating the state's capacity to organize massive undertakings. The tower was, in essence, an advertisement of Babylonian power, a statement to neighboring kingdoms that here was a civilization capable of moving mountains of earth and brick. The environmental impact of the tower's construction was also significant. The production of millions of bricks required enormous amounts of fuel for the kilns, leading to deforestation in the surrounding region. The extraction of clay altered the local landscape, creating quarries and pits that would have been visible for centuries. The transport of materials required the construction of roads and waterways, infrastructure that would have transformed the region's geography. In this sense, the tower was not just a building, but a landscape intervention on a massive scale. The social stratification revealed by the tower's construction provides insights into ancient Babylonian society that written records alone cannot convey. The skilled craftsmen who designed and supervised the construction occupied a middle stratum between the ruling elite and the masses of conscripted laborers. These craftsmen developed specialized techniques and knowledge that were passed down through generations, creating a kind of technological aristocracy. The tower thus became not just a religious monument, but a repository of technical knowledge and social organization. The acoustic properties of the tower were likely as carefully considered as its visual impact. The stepped structure would have created complex patterns of sound reflection and amplification. Prayers and chants performed at the summit would have echoed down through the levels, creating a cascading effect that could be heard throughout the sacred district. The tower may have functioned as a giant acoustic instrument, designed to carry the voice of the priests to the ears of the gods and the people alike. The destruction of the tower was not a single event, but a gradual process that stretched over centuries. Each successive ruler faced the choice of maintaining the massive structure or allowing it to decay. The cost of upkeep was enormous, requiring constant repairs to the mud brick core and regular replacement of the fired brick facing. As political power shifted and religious priorities changed, the tower became an increasingly expensive anachronism. The process of abandonment was thus not traumatic, but bureaucratic, a slow withdrawal of resources and attention that eventually left the structure vulnerable to natural forces. The psychological impact of the tower's ruins on later civilizations cannot be underestimated. For peoples who had heard stories of the Great Tower but had never seen it intact, the scattered remains must have been both disappointing and awe-inspiring. The gap between legend and reality created a space for imagination to flourish, leading to ever more elaborate stories about the tower's original grandeur. The ruins became a kind of Rorschach test, reflecting the hopes and fears of each culture that encountered them. The tower's influence on later architectural traditions is subtle but significant. The stepped pyramid forms that appeared in later American civilizations, from the Maya to the Aztecs, show remarkable similarities to Mesopotamian ziggurats. While direct cultural transmission is unlikely, the similarities suggest that the stepped pyramid represents a fundamental human approach to monumental architecture, a way of creating structures that bridge the gap between earth and sky. The Tower of Babel thus becomes not just a specific building, but a prototype for human ambition in stone. The literary tradition surrounding the tower has evolved far beyond its biblical origins. Modern fiction has used the tower as a setting for stories about everything from time travel to alien contact. Science fiction writers have imagined the tower as a launch pad for space exploration, while fantasy authors have depicted it as a gateway to other dimensions. Each generation finds new ways to interpret the tower's symbolic potential, ensuring that its story continues to evolve and resonate. The tower's connection to contemporary issues of globalization and cultural diversity gives it particular relevance in our interconnected world. The story of linguistic confusion has been interpreted as a parable about the challenges of international communication, the difficulties of maintaining cultural identity in a global society, and the tension between unity and diversity. Modern debates about language policy, cultural preservation, and global governance often invoke the Tower of Babel as a cautionary tale or a source of wisdom. The site of ancient Babylon continues to be a place of pilgrimage and contemplation for people from around the world. Modern visitors come not just to see the archaeological remains, but to connect with the stories and symbols that have shaped human civilization. The site has become a kind of secular sacred space where people of different faiths and backgrounds can reflect on the common themes of human ambition, divine mystery, and the search for meaning. The digital age has created new possibilities for experiencing the tower's legacy. Virtual reality reconstructions allow people to walk through the ancient structure as it might have appeared at its height. Online databases preserve the cuneiform inscriptions that mention the tower, making them accessible to scholars and enthusiasts worldwide. Social media has created new communities of people interested in the tower's history and symbolism, ensuring that its story continues to spread and evolve. The tower's story ultimately transcends its historical specifics to become a meditation on the nature of human achievement and limitation. It reminds us that our greatest works are temporary, that our proudest accomplishments will eventually return to dust. Yet it also suggests that the impulse to build, to reach beyond ourselves, to create something larger than our individual existence, is itself eternal and valuable. The tower stands as a testament to the nobility of human ambition, even when that ambition exceeds our grasp. Now, as the last imagined shadow of the tower fades into the dust, we make our final turn, down from the clouds and into the courtyards of Babylon's most privileged. The same hands that shaped the bricks of Itamananki also prepared feasts of unimaginable luxury. The same empire that could organize the construction of heaven-reaching towers could also orchestrate banquets that would shame the gods themselves. What did the elite eat and drink in this storied city? What tastes and smells filled their banquets? What stories did the food tell about power, wealth, and the delicate art of living well beside the Euphrates? Let's step into the kitchens and feast halls of the past, where luxury wore a different face, and every meal was a statement about who held the keys to paradise. As the sun lowered beyond the wide Mesopotamian plain, the courtyards of Babylon began to glow with soft amber light. In the homes of the wealthy, the day's heat eased, and the stone floors grew cool beneath bare feet. Servants moved quietly through shaded walkways, their arms balanced with trays of food and ceramic jugs. The air filled with the scent of roasting meat, stewed vegetables, and freshly baked bread. The city began to hush, but inside the grander homes, the night was only beginning. The transformation from day to evening in these elite households was itself a choreographed performance. As the merciless Mesopotamian sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the flat-roofed houses, the wealthy districts of Babylon underwent their daily metamorphosis. The brutal heat that had driven even the most privileged indoors during the afternoon hours slowly retreated, replaced by the gentle warmth that made outdoor dining not just possible, but pleasurable. In the house of Nabu Imani, a successful merchant whose caravans brought cedar from Lebanon and lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan, the evening preparations had begun hours before the first guest would arrive. The household staff, trained in the intricate rituals of hospitality, moved with practiced efficiency through rooms that spoke of wealth accumulated over generations. The walls, painted in deep blues and rich ochres, bore the subtle marks of prosperity. Glazed tiles depicting stylized lions and bulls, bronze fittings polished to mirror brightness, and niches filled with carefully arranged vessels of silver and gold. Courtyards themselves were masterpieces of design, created not merely for function, but for the subtle display of power. The central space, open to the sky, was surrounded by covered walkways supported by columns of fired brick. These columns, broader at the base than at the top, created a sense of both stability and elegance. The floor was paved with fired bricks arranged in geometric patterns, their surfaces worn smooth by countless footsteps and scrubbed daily until they gleamed. Around the edges, channels carved into the stone carried water from the household's private well, creating a gentle murmur that masked conversation from unwelcome ears. Water was everywhere in these elite homes, not merely for practical purposes, but as a symbol of abundance in a land where irrigation meant survival. Shallow pools lined with blue glazed tiles reflected the evening sky, their surfaces occasionally disturbed by the soft splash of ornamental fish. The sound of water trickling through carved spouts added to the atmosphere of serene luxury, a constant reminder that this household commanded resources beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. Gardens within the courtyards provided both beauty and sustenance. Date palms, their fronds rustling in the evening breeze, offered shade during the day and sweet fruit for the table. Between their trunks grew smaller trees and bushes. Pomegranates with their ruby-red flowers, fig trees heavy with fruit, and carefully tended herb gardens where mint, coriander, and cumin grew in neat rows. These gardens were not mere decoration, but working spaces that contributed to the household's self-sufficiency and demonstrated the owner's mastery over nature itself. To dine among the Babylonian elite was not just about eating. It was a ritual, a moment of social performance shaped by wealth, reputation, and tradition. Meals offered comfort, but also connection. They reflected the abundance of the land and the reach of the city's trade. Along the banks of the Euphrates, barley and wheat grew in well-managed fields. Gardens provided lentils, onions, and garlic. Dates were harvested in great quantities, their sweetness woven into every course. Fish were pulled from the river, fresh or dried and spiced, depending on the season. The procurement of food for these elaborate meals required networks that stretched across the known world, while the fertile fields surrounding Babylon provided the foundation of every meal. The tables of the wealthy were enhanced by goods that traveled thousands of miles. Saffron came from the western mountains, its golden threads worth more than their weight in silver. Cinnamon bark arrived from distant India, carried by merchants who guarded its source as carefully as state secrets. Even salt, essential for preserving food and enhancing flavor, came from specialized sources, some from the salt flats near the Persian Gulf, others from mountain deposits where it formed in pure white crystals. The daily markets of Babylon reflected this vast network of trade. In the early morning hours, before the heat became unbearable, the city's squares filled with vendors hawking their wares. Professional buyers for the wealthy households moved through these markets with practiced eyes, selecting the finest ingredients for their employers' tables. They knew which fishermen brought in the freshest catch, which farmers grew the plumpest vegetables, which bakers produced the finest flour. These relationships, built over years of daily interaction, ensured that the elite tables were supplied with ingredients that met the exacting standards of Babylonian hospitality. Preparation of these ingredients required skilled hands and patient attention. In the kitchens of the wealthy, cooking was not merely a matter of combining ingredients, but of transforming them into something that would reflect the household's status and refinement. The head cook, often a trusted servant who had served the family for decades, supervised every aspect of the meal's preparation. Under his guidance, junior cooks learned the subtle art of seasoning, the precise timing required for perfect bread, and the delicate balance needed to create sauces that enhanced rather than overwhelmed natural flavors of the ingredients. These kitchens were marvels of efficiency and organization. Built around large ovens constructed of fired brick, they could accommodate the preparation of elaborate meals for dozens of guests. Clay vessels of every size and shape lined the walls, each designed for specific purposes. Wide, shallow pans for frying, deep pots for stewing, narrow-necked jars for storing oils and vinegars. Wooden spoons and ladles, worn smooth by constant use, hung from hooks driven into the walls. Stone mortar and pestles, some large enough to require 2 people to operate, were used to grind spices and crush grains. The hearth itself was the heart of these kitchens, a carefully constructed furnace that could maintain different temperatures in different sections. The skilled cooks who worked there knew exactly where to place each pot for optimal cooking, how to bank the coals for slow roasting, and when to add fresh fuel to maintain the precise heat required for delicate sauces. Smoke from these fires carried the aromas of the evening's feast throughout the house, a subtle announcement to arriving guests that something special awaited them. Storage was another crucial element of these household operations. The wealthy maintained vast stocks of ingredients that allowed them to entertain at a moment's notice. Underground chambers, cool and dry, held amphorae filled with wine and oil. Granaries built into the walls of the house stored different grades of flour, from the coarse meal used for servants' bread to the fine white flour reserved for the master's table. Salt, that most precious of preservatives, was kept in sealed containers that protected it from moisture. Dried fruits, nuts, and spices were stored in wooden chests lined with aromatic cedar, their contents carefully inventoried and regularly inspected. In wealthier homes, the evening meal was slow and layered. Guests would gather in open courtyards, where low tables were surrounded by cushioned benches. Woven mats softened the stone floor. Clay lamps flickered in alcoves. Around them, food was brought out in wide bowls and flat platters. Bread made from finely ground flour was passed first, often warm and soft from clay ovens. Stews followed, thick with chickpeas, leeks, or lamb, simmered with crushed coriander. There were plates of pickled vegetables, trays of soft cheese, and sometimes roasted birds brushed with a mixture of honey and oil. The arrangement of the dining space reflected centuries of refined hospitality. The low tables, carved from precious woods and inlaid with ivory and precious stones, were positioned to encourage conversation while maintaining the subtle hierarchies that governed Babylonian society. The host's place was clearly marked, usually positioned so that he could observe all his guests while maintaining easy access to the kitchen areas. The most honored guests were seated to his right, their positions indicating their status in the complex web of relationships that bound the elite together. Cushions and carpets provided both comfort and display. The finest pieces, woven by skilled artisans in the mountains to the north, featured intricate patterns that told stories of gods and heroes. These textiles, worth small fortunes, were handled with reverence and stored carefully when not in use. The colors, deep blues and rich reds achieved through expensive dyes, remained vivid even after years of use, testament to the skill of their creators and the care with which they were maintained. Lighting played a crucial role in creating the proper atmosphere for these gatherings. Oil lamps, fueled by pressed olive oil or rendered animal fat, were positioned throughout the dining area to provide gentle illumination without creating harsh shadows. The lamps themselves were works of art, their clay bodies shaped into forms that ranged from simple elegance to elaborate decoration. Some were imported from distant lands, their foreign designs adding an exotic touch to the domestic scene. Others were made by local craftsmen who had perfected their art over generations, creating pieces that combined functionality with beauty. The flickering light from these lamps created an ever-changing play of shadows and highlights across the faces of the diners, adding to the sense of intimacy and mystery that characterized these gatherings. The warm glow softened harsh features and enhanced the rich colors of clothing and jewelry, creating an atmosphere where conversation flowed as freely as the wine, and where the bonds of friendship and alliance were strengthened through shared pleasure. Service at these meals was an art form in itself. Servants, trained from childhood in the intricacies of formal dining, moved through the gathering with silent efficiency. They understood the unspoken signals that indicated when a guest's cup needed refilling, when the next course should be brought out, or when the gathering was ready for entertainment. These servants, often born into the household or acquired as children and raised within it, formed an integral part of the family unit, their loyalty and discretion as valuable as their skills. The meal was not rushed. Each dish arrived quietly, and guests took their time. Drinking was part of the rhythm. Beer, made from fermented barley and flavored with dates or herbs, was served in large jars. Long straws filtered the sediment, allowing guests to sip slowly without disturbance. Wine existed, but it was less common and often imported. Beer was the everyday drink, familiar and satisfying, especially when shared among those with status. The leisurely pace of these meals reflected deeper cultural values about time, relationship, and pleasure. In a society where the rhythm of life was dictated by the cycles of agriculture and the demands of trade, these evening gatherings represented a temporary escape from the pressures of daily existence. Time seemed to slow, allowing for the kind of deep conversation and careful attention to food and company that built lasting relationships and cemented business partnerships. The brewing of beer for these occasions was itself a sophisticated process that required considerable skill and attention. The best brewers, often women who had learned the art from their mothers and grandmothers, understood the subtle interplay of ingredients and timing that produced the perfect beverage. Barley, the foundation of all good beer, was carefully selected and malted, a process that required precise control of moisture and temperature. The grain was then ground to the proper consistency, not too fine that it would produce a cloudy brew, not too coarse that it would fail to release its sugars. The fermentation process was closely guarded, with each brewer maintaining their own strain of yeast and their own secret combination of flavorings. Some added honey to increase the alcohol content and add sweetness. Others used herbs like thyme or mint to create distinctive flavors. Date syrup, a ubiquitous sweetener in Mesopotamian cuisine, was often added to create a rich, complex taste that paired well with the hearty foods of the region. The serving of beer was as ritualized as its preparation. The large jars, often decorated with elaborate designs, were brought to the table and placed in specially constructed stands that kept them stable and accessible. The straws used to drink the beer were not mere conveniences, but works of art in themselves. Made from precious metals or carved from rare woods, they were often decorated with intricate patterns, and sometimes tipped with small filters made from fine mesh or perforated metal. The act of sharing beer from a common jar was deeply symbolic, representing the bonds of trust and friendship that united the diners. To drink from the same vessel was to acknowledge a relationship that transcended mere business or social convenience. It was a gesture of intimacy that bound the participants together in a web of mutual obligation and support. Wine, when it appeared at these gatherings, carried even greater significance. More expensive and exotic than beer, it was often reserved for the most special occasions or the most honored guests. The wine trade in ancient Babylon was dominated by merchants who specialized in this luxury commodity, importing amphorae from the hillsides of Armenia and the mountains of Persia. These wines, made from grapes grown in cooler climates, offered flavors that were impossible to achieve with local ingredients. The serving of wine required its own set of rituals and equipment. Special cups, often made from precious metals or exotic materials, were used exclusively for wine service. The wine itself was often mixed with water, not merely to extend its quantity, but to achieve the proper balance of flavors. Spices might be added to create unique blends, and honey was sometimes used to sweeten particularly harsh vintages. Spices played a subtle role. Cumin and mint, garlic and mustard seed were used with care. They added richness to meat and warmth to stews. Saffron, when available, colored dishes with golden hues. Food was never overly sharp or strong. Instead, it was comforting, balanced, designed to ease the body as much as it satisfied the tongue. Sweetness often came at the end, in the form of dried fruit or date cakes shaped into small rounds and dusted with flour or crushed nuts. The philosophy behind Babylonian cuisine reflected a deep understanding of the relationship between food and well-being. Unlike some cultures that prized intense flavors or exotic preparations, the Babylonian approach emphasized harmony and balance. Each dish was conceived as part of a larger whole, with flavors that complemented rather than competed with one another. The goal was not to overwhelm the palate, but to create a progression of tastes that would satisfy both physical hunger and emotional need. This approach to seasoning required tremendous skill and restraint. The cooks who prepared these meals understood that a heavy hand with spices could mask the natural flavors of ingredients rather than enhance them. They knew which spices paired well with specific meats, how to balance the sweetness of dates with the earthiness of grains, and when to add acid to brighten a dish without overwhelming its essential character. The procurement of spices was itself a major undertaking that involved the most far-reaching trade networks of the ancient world. Cinnamon came from the distant islands of the Indian Ocean, carried by merchants who guarded their roots as carefully as military secrets. Black pepper, so valuable that it was sometimes used as currency, arrived from the forests of southern India. Ginger, prized for its warming properties, traveled overland from the mountains of Central Asia. Each spice represented not just a flavor, but a connection to distant lands and exotic cultures. The preparation of these spices required specialized knowledge and equipment. Most were ground fresh for each meal, their volatile oils released only at the moment of use. Stone mortar and pestles, some so large they required 2 people to operate, were used to achieve the perfect consistency. Some spices were toasted before grinding to intensify their flavors, while others were used whole to provide texture and visual appeal. The storage of spices was a constant challenge in the hot, humid climate of Mesopotamia. Precious seasonings were kept in sealed containers made from materials that would protect them from moisture and insects. Clay jars with tight-fitting lids or lined with aromatic woods to prevent contamination. Some spices were mixed with salt to prevent spoilage, while others were stored in oil to preserve their potency. The use of salt itself was more complex than simple seasoning. Different types of salt were used for different purposes. Fine white crystals for delicate dishes, coarse gray salt for preserving meat, and mineral-rich deposits for their supposed medicinal properties. The skilled cooks of the wealthy households understood these distinctions and used them to create layers of flavor that would develop and change throughout the meal. Sweetness in Babylonian cuisine came primarily from dates, the fruit that grew in vast groves throughout the region. These dates were not just eaten fresh, but were processed into syrups, pastes, and flours that could be used in countless ways. Date syrup, thick and dark, was used to glaze meats and sweeten beverages. Date paste, combined with nuts and spices, created rich confections that served as both dessert and digestive aid. Even date flour, made from dried and ground fruit, was used to add sweetness and moisture to baked goods. The preparation of dates for these various uses required considerable skill and patience. Fresh dates were sorted by size and quality, with the finest reserved for eating whole and the smaller or blemished fruit destined for processing. The drying process had to be carefully controlled to prevent spoilage while concentrating the fruit's natural sugars. The grinding and cooking that transformed dates into syrups and pastes required constant attention to prevent burning or crystallization. Entertainment accompanied many elite meals. Musicians played soft melodies on lyres or flutes. A singer might recite an old poem about kingship or the turning of the stars. Storytellers, often older men with calm voices, would recount myths of the gods or the history of the city's founders. Their voices rose and fell gently in the night, weaving images that lingered long after the final notes faded. The entertainment provided at these gatherings was as carefully planned as the menu itself. Musicians were often professionals who had trained for years to master their instruments and repertoire. The lyre, with its delicate strings and resonant wooden body, was the queen of Mesopotamian instruments. Skilled players could coax from it melodies that ranged from simple folk songs to complex compositions that told epic stories through music alone. The construction of these instruments was itself an art form. The finest lyres were made from precious woods imported from distant forests, their surfaces inlaid with gold and precious stones. The strings, made from sheep gut or silk, were carefully tensioned to produce the proper pitch and tone. The sound boxes were often decorated with elaborate carvings depicting scenes from mythology or history, making each instrument a work of art as well as a musical tool. Flutes and pipes added their voices to the musical ensemble, their clear tones providing counterpoint to the deeper resonance of the stringed instruments. These wind instruments were often made from precious materials, silver, gold, or rare woods that had been aged for decades to achieve the proper acoustic properties. The mouthpieces were carved to fit perfectly against the player's lips, allowing for the subtle control of breath and pitch that characterized the best performances. The repertoire of these musicians was vast and varied, encompassing everything from ancient hymns praising the gods to contemporary compositions celebrating recent victories or important events. Love songs, drinking songs, and lullabies all had their place in the evening's entertainment. The skilled musician knew when to provide background music that enhanced conversation and when to perform pieces that demanded attention and silence. Singers held a special place in this musical hierarchy. The best were trained from childhood, not just in vocal technique, but in the art of storytelling through song. They memorized thousands of verses, learning to adapt their performances to the mood and interests of their audience. Epic poems about legendary heroes, romantic ballads about star-crossed lovers, and humorous songs about everyday life all flowed from their lips with equal skill. The storytellers who appeared at these gatherings were keepers of cultural memory, preserving in their trained minds the accumulated wisdom and experience of their civilization. These men, often elderly and revered for their knowledge, had spent decades learning the traditional tales that explained the origins of the world, the adventures of the gods, and the history of the city itself. Their performances were not mere entertainment, but educational experiences that reinforced cultural values and transmitted important knowledge to the next generation. The stories themselves were carefully structured to hold the attention of listeners while conveying important information. They used repetition, parallel structure, and vivid imagery to make their tales memorable and meaningful. The best storytellers could adapt their narratives to their audience, emphasizing different aspects of a tale depending on the interests and concerns of their listeners. The setting mattered. Elite homes were built for display. Walls were painted in soft colors. Pools of water lined with tile reflected the moonlight. Furniture was sparse, but crafted with care. In this environment, food and atmosphere worked together to reinforce power without open display. Guests left well fed, but also reminded of the host's refinement, stability, and generosity. The architecture of these elite homes was a careful balance between comfort and display, privacy, and accessibility. The main reception areas were designed to impress visitors while maintaining the intimate atmosphere necessary for meaningful conversation. Walls were painted with scenes from mythology or decorated with geometric patterns that demonstrated the owner's sophistication and cultural refinement. The pigments used for these decorations were often expensive imports: ultramarine from lapis lazuli, vermilion from cinnabar, and gold leaf that caught and reflected the lamplight. The construction of these homes required skilled craftsmen who understood both the practical necessities of life in Mesopotamia and the aesthetic requirements of the elite. Walls were built thick to provide insulation against the extreme temperatures of the region. Flat roofs were constructed to shed the occasional rains while providing space for additional activities. Doorways were positioned to channel cooling breezes through the interior spaces. Creating natural air conditioning made the homes comfortable even during the hottest seasons. The pools and water features that graced these homes were marvels of engineering as well as beauty. The water was supplied by an elaborate system of channels and pipes that brought fresh water from the city's main aqueducts. The pools themselves were lined with glazed tiles that prevented seepage while creating surfaces that sparkled in the lamplight. Some pools contained fish, both for decoration and as a source of fresh protein. Others were planted with water lily and other aquatic plants that added color and fragrance to the environment. The furniture in these homes was crafted by skilled artisans who understood that every piece must serve multiple purposes. Tables were designed to be both functional and beautiful, their surfaces inlaid with precious materials and their legs carved in forms that reflected the owner's taste and status. Chairs and benches were constructed for comfort during long meals, their seats cushioned with expensive fabrics and their backs angled to provide support without formality. Storage furniture was equally important, providing secure places for the household's treasures while contributing to the room's aesthetic appeal. Chests and cabinets were often decorated with elaborate carvings or inlaid with contrasting woods. Their interiors were lined with aromatic cedar or other woods that would protect valuable contents from insects and moisture. The lighting in these homes was designed to create atmosphere while providing adequate illumination for all activities. Oil lamps were positioned at different heights and angles to eliminate harsh shadows while creating pools of warm light that encouraged intimate conversation. Mirrors, made from polished bronze or silver, were positioned to reflect and multiply the light, creating the illusion of larger spaces and brighter illumination. A Babylonian banquet was a private pleasure, but it was also a public statement. It showed that the household had enough to share, that its stores were full, that its servants were trained, that its family could afford the time and space to entertain. The rules were unspoken, but understood by all. The social significance of these gatherings extended far beyond their immediate participants. In a society where reputation was often more valuable than material wealth, the ability to entertain lavishly was a crucial marker of status and success. Word of particularly impressive banquets spread through the elite community, enhancing the host's reputation and solidifying his position in the complex hierarchy of Babylonian society. The invitation to such a gathering was itself a form of social currency. To be included in the guest list was to be recognized as someone worthy of the host's attention and resources. The carefully constructed guest lists reflected the host's relationships and aspirations, bringing together people who could advance his interests while excluding those who might diminish his standing. The preparation for these events required coordination and planning that extended far beyond the immediate household. Relationships with suppliers had to be maintained, special ingredients had to be procured, and additional staff might need to be hired or borrowed. The host's wife, if he had one, played a crucial role in these preparations, overseeing the domestic arrangements while her husband managed the social and political aspects of the gathering. The servants who worked these events were often borrowed from other households or hired specifically for the occasion. Their performance reflected directly on their employer's reputation, making their training and supervision a matter of considerable importance. The best servants were those who could anticipate needs before they were expressed, who could move through the gathering without disturbing the flow of conversation, and who could handle unexpected situations with grace and discretion. The clothing worn by both hosts and guests was carefully chosen to reflect the significance of the occasion. The finest fabrics, often imported from distant lands, were brought out of storage and prepared for the evening. Jewelry was selected not just for its beauty, but for its symbolic significance, with certain pieces indicating the wearer's status, profession, or family connections. The food served at these gatherings was subject to complex rules and expectations that governed everything from the order of service to the size of portions. Certain dishes were considered appropriate for certain types of guests, while others were reserved for the most honored visitors. The skilled host understood these nuances and used them to send subtle messages about his regard for each of his guests. The cleanup after these events was almost as elaborate as the preparation. Valuable dishes and utensils had to be carefully cleaned and stored. Leftover food was distributed according to strict protocols, with certain items going to favored servants, others to the poor, and still others preserved for future use. The host's reputation could be damaged as much by waste as by insufficient provision. As the night grew deeper, lamps dimmed and conversation slowed. One by one, guests stood to leave. The scent of herbs and smoke still lingered. Outside, the streets were quiet again. In the distance, the ziggurat rose, dark against the stars. Babylon, for all its movement, returned once more to stillness. The departure of guests was as carefully orchestrated as their arrival. The host would personally escort the most important visitors to the door, often presenting them with small gifts as tokens of his appreciation for their presence. These gifts, while modest in value, carried significant symbolic weight, serving as reminders of the evening's pleasures and the host's generosity. The servants who had worked throughout the evening now began the process of restoration, carefully cleaning and storing the precious items that had been used for the meal. The lamps were extinguished one by one, their flames dying away to leave only the soft glow of the banked cooking fires. The courtyards, so recently alive with conversation and laughter, gradually returned to their daytime quiet. The host himself would often remain in the courtyard for a few minutes after the last guest had departed, savoring the satisfaction of a successful evening and reflecting on the connections that had been strengthened or the business that had been advanced. These moments of solitude, surrounded by the evidence of his prosperity and the lingering aromas of the feast, reinforced his sense of achievement and his place in the complex web of Babylonian society. The night air carried the mingled sense of the evening throughout the wealthy quarter of the city. Other households, having hosted their own gatherings or having sent their members to similar events, were settling into their own patterns of post-banquet quiet. The rhythms of elite social life were synchronized across the city, creating a shared experience that bound the upper classes together in their common pursuit of refinement and status. In the distance, the great ziggurat stood sentinel over the sleeping city, its massive bulk a reminder of the divine order that governed all human affairs. The gods who dwelt in its sacred precincts had their own feasts and celebrations, described in the ancient texts that the priests studied and preserved. The earthly banquets of the elite were pale reflections of these divine gatherings, attempts to capture something of the perfection and abundance that characterized the realm of the gods. The silence that settled over Babylon in the hours after midnight was not empty, but full of memory and meaning. In the houses of the wealthy, the evening's conversations would be remembered and discussed in the days to come. Business relationships would be pursued, social alliances would be strengthened, and the complex web of obligation and opportunity that governed elite society would be rewoven in countless subtle ways. We have now wandered through this ancient world together, from the cramped stillness of the scribe's chamber to the firm voice of Hammurabi's laws, from the vanished tower that once pointed toward the sky to the slow meals taken in the courts of the wealthy. Before we part for the night, let us gently return to the present and bring this story to a close. Yet even as we prepare to leave these ancient courtyards behind, the shadows seem to whisper of other stories, other lives lived within these walls. Beyond the glittering world of the elite, in the narrow streets and humble workshops of the city, different kinds of meals were being prepared, different kinds of lives were being lived. The baker who rose before dawn to prepare the fine bread for the wealthy tables had his own story to tell. The fisherman who netted the river's bounty had his own traditions and troubles. The merchants who traveled the dangerous roads between distant cities carried with them not just goods, but tales of strange lands and stranger customs. The economics of these lavish gatherings extended far beyond their immediate costs, creating ripple effects that touched every level of Babylonian society. The demand for luxury ingredients drove entire industries, from the silk merchants who imported their precious fabrics from distant China to the perfume makers who distilled essences from rare flowers and resins. Professional tasters, skilled in detecting the subtle differences between various grades of wine and oil, commanded high wages for their expertise. Even the lowliest kitchen servants could expect generous tips from guests who appreciated excellent service. The seasonal nature of these banquets followed the rhythms of trade and agriculture. Spring brought the first fresh vegetables and young livestock, celebrated with meals that emphasized renewal and abundance. Summer's heat drove the wealthy to seek cooling foods, chilled soups, fresh fruits, and delicate preparations that would not overwhelm the palate. Autumn's harvest festivals featured the bounty of the fields, with elaborate displays of grain, fruit, and preserved foods that would sustain the household through winter's scarcity. Winter banquets were perhaps the most impressive, demonstrating the host's ability to maintain luxury even when fresh ingredients were scarce. Preserved meats, carefully stored wines, and exotic spices created meals that defied the season's limitations. The contrast between the cold, dark streets outside and the warm, illuminated courtyards within made these gatherings particularly memorable, creating associations between the host's generosity and refuge from hardship. The medical aspects of these meals were carefully considered by the wealthy, who understood that food could serve as medicine as well as nourishment. Certain combinations of ingredients were believed to promote health and longevity, while others might aid digestion or ward off disease. The inclusion of specific herbs and spices was often as much about their supposed medicinal properties as their flavor contributions. Professional physicians, trained in the ancient medical traditions of Mesopotamia, might be consulted about the proper foods for different occasions or different types of guests. Elderly visitors might be served foods that were believed to strengthen the constitution, while younger guests might receive dishes thought to enhance vigor and vitality. Women and men were sometimes offered different preparations, reflecting contemporary beliefs about the dietary needs of different genders. The psychological dimensions of these gatherings were equally sophisticated. The careful progression of dishes, the strategic placement of guests, and the timing of entertainment were all designed to create specific emotional responses. A business negotiation might begin with light, easily digestible foods that would keep the mind sharp, while a celebration might feature rich, satisfying dishes that encouraged conviviality and relaxation. The host's own behavior during these events was subject to complex protocols that required years of training to master. He must appear gracious and generous without seeming eager for approval. knowledgeable about his guests' preferences without appearing to spy on their private lives, and prosperous without being ostentatious. The slightest misstep could damage relationships that had taken years to build. The serving vessels themselves told stories of wealth and connection. Bowls carved from rare woods spoke of trade relationships with distant mountain peoples. Cups made from rhinoceros horn or elephant ivory demonstrated connections to the most exotic markets. Even the common clay vessels were often decorated with intricate designs that revealed the artistic sophistication of their makers. The recycling and reuse of materials from these banquets followed strict social rules. Leftover foods were distributed in ways that reinforced the household's relationships with servants, neighbors, and the broader community. The best portions might be sent to other elite households as gifts, while simpler preparations found their way to the doors of the deserving poor. Nothing was wasted, but everything was allocated according to its proper place in the social hierarchy. The training of the next generation in these elaborate customs began in childhood. Young members of elite families were expected to observe and gradually participate in these gatherings, learning through experience the subtle arts of hospitality and social interaction. They practiced the proper ways to greet guests, the correct methods of serving food and drink, and the delicate balance between conversation and silence that characterized refined society. Marriage alliances were often negotiated over these elaborate meals, with the quality of the hospitality serving as a measure of the family's suitability as partners. The ability to provide properly for guests was seen as an indication of the family's ability to provide for their children's future welfare. Young people of marriageable age were displayed at these gatherings like precious objects, their beauty and accomplishments highlighted by the elegant setting. The religious dimensions of these meals connected them to the broader spiritual life of the city. Certain foods were associated with specific deities, and their inclusion in the menu might be intended to invoke divine favor or protection. The first portions of particularly fine dishes were sometimes set aside as offerings to the household gods, whose small shrines occupied places of honor in the dining areas. The influence of these elite dining customs extended far beyond the households that practiced them. Successful merchants and skilled craftsmen aspired to recreate these experiences in their own homes, driving demand for the ingredients, vessels, and expertise that made such gatherings possible. The styles and preferences of the elite filtered down through society, shaping the food culture of the entire city. The political implications of these gatherings were enormous. Treaties might be negotiated over elaborate meals, with the quality of the hospitality serving as a measure of the host's commitment to the relationship. Foreign dignitaries were entertained with displays of local abundance and sophistication, creating impressions that could influence diplomatic relations for years to come. The exclusion of certain individuals from these gatherings could be as politically significant as their inclusion. The preservation of these traditions required constant vigilance and adaptation. As trade routes changed and new ingredients became available, the menus evolved to incorporate novel elements while maintaining their essential character. As political circumstances shifted and new families rose to prominence, the guest lists were carefully adjusted to reflect changing realities. The successful host was one who could adapt to these changes while maintaining the fundamental principles that made these gatherings meaningful. The memory of these evenings lived on long after the last guest had departed and the final lamp had been extinguished. They became part of the family's history, stories told and retold to subsequent generations. The recipes were preserved and passed down, often with precise instructions about their proper preparation and presentation. The connections made at these gatherings formed networks that could span generations, creating bonds of obligation and opportunity that shaped the destiny of entire families. The artistic legacy of these banquets extended into the very walls of the homes that hosted them. Skilled painters were commissioned to create murals depicting scenes of abundance and hospitality, their work serving as permanent reminders of the household's capacity for generosity. These paintings, executed in pigments that would retain their vibrancy for centuries, often featured idealized versions of the very meals that had been served in these rooms. Gods and goddesses were shown partaking of earthly delights, bridging the gap between divine and mortal experience. The influence of these dining customs reached into the realm of literature and poetry, where scribes and scholars recorded not just the practical details of hospitality, but its emotional and spiritual significance. Love poems spoke of shared meals as expressions of devotion, while epic tales used banquet scenes to establish the wealth and power of their heroes. The metaphors and imagery drawn from these gatherings permeated the language itself, creating expressions and idioms that would survive long after the civilization that created them had fallen into dust. The construction of serving dishes and utensils for these occasions became a specialized craft that supported entire guilds of artisans. Master potters developed techniques for creating vessels that were both beautiful and functional, their glazes achieving colors and textures that had never been seen before. Metalworkers perfected alloys that would resist tarnishing and corrosion, ensuring that precious serving pieces would retain their beauty through countless meals. The decoration of these items often incorporated religious symbols and protective charms, making them not just tools but talismans that would bring good fortune to their users. The international reputation of Babylonian hospitality became a tool of diplomacy and trade. Foreign merchants and diplomats returned to their home countries with tales of the magnificent banquets they had attended, spreading the fame of Babylonian wealth and sophistication throughout the known world. This reputation opened doors for trade negotiations and political alliances, as other rulers sought to align themselves with a civilization that could offer such tangible evidence of divine favor and material success. The training of servants for these elaborate occasions created a specialized labor market that extended far beyond the boundaries of individual households. Professional agencies emerged to provide skilled workers for special events, their employees trained in the particular requirements of elite entertaining. These servants often moved between households, carrying with them knowledge of different customs and preferences that made them increasingly valuable as their experience grew. The scheduling of these banquets required careful coordination with the religious calendar, as certain days were considered more auspicious than others for different types of gatherings. The phases of the moon, the position of the stars, and the seasonal festivals all influenced when and how these events were planned. Professional astrologers and priests were consulted to ensure that the timing of important banquets would align with favorable celestial conditions. The preservation of food for these occasions required sophisticated techniques that pushed the boundaries of contemporary knowledge. Salt curing, smoking, fermentation, and honey preservation were all employed to extend the shelf life of precious ingredients. Ice, when it could be obtained from the distant mountains, was transported in specially designed containers that could maintain its frozen state for days or even weeks. The households that mastered these preservation techniques could offer their guests delicacies that were completely out of season, adding another layer of impressiveness to their hospitality. The music and entertainment that accompanied these meals evolved into distinct art forms that influenced the broader cultural life of the city. Composers created works specifically for banquet performance, their pieces designed to complement the rhythm of dining and conversation. Dancers developed choreographies that could be performed in the confined spaces of courtyards, their movements synchronized with the serving of different courses. These performances were not mere background entertainment, but integral parts of the dining experience, carefully timed to enhance the emotional impact of the meal. The flowers and decorations that adorned these gatherings were cultivated in specialized gardens that existed solely to provide beauty for the tables of the wealthy. Rare blooms were imported from distant lands, their exotic fragrances adding another dimension to the sensory experience of the meal. The arrangement of these decorations followed artistic principles that had been developed over generations, creating compositions that would complement the food and enhance the overall atmosphere of the gathering. The waste management from these elaborate events required careful planning and execution. Organic waste was composted and returned to the gardens that provided ingredients for future meals, creating a cycle of renewal that reflected the household's connection to the natural world. Broken pottery and damaged utensils were often repaired by skilled craftsmen, their restoration adding to the item's history and value. Even the ash from the cooking fires was carefully collected and used in the production of soap and other household necessities. The influence of these dining customs extended into the legal realm, where contracts and agreements were often sealed over shared meals. The act of eating together created bonds of trust and obligation that were recognized by law and custom. Business partnerships were formalized through elaborate banquets that served as both celebration and binding ceremony, their witnesses drawn from the most respected members of the community. The evolution of table manners and dining etiquette during these gatherings created behavioral codes that influenced social interaction far beyond the dining room. The proper way to hold utensils, the correct posture for eating, and the appropriate responses to various social situations were all refined through the practice of elite dining. These codes became markers of social status, instantly identifying those who had been raised in refined households and distinguishing them from those of lower birth. The medical knowledge applied to these meals extended beyond simple nutrition to encompass complex theories about the relationship between food, health, and spiritual well-being. Different foods were believed to influence not just physical health, but emotional states and mental acuity. The careful selection and combination of ingredients could allegedly promote courage, enhance wisdom, or encourage romantic feelings, making the host's menu choices a form of subtle influence over his guests. The technological innovations driven by the demands of elite dining contributed to advances in agriculture, food processing, and storage that benefited society as a whole. New varieties of crops were developed to meet the exacting standards of wealthy tables, while improved irrigation and cultivation techniques increased yields and quality. The knowledge gained from feeding the elite eventually filtered down to improve the diet and nutrition of the broader population. Perhaps it is time to venture beyond the perfumed courtyards of the elite and discover what lay hidden in the shadows of the great city. What secrets did the common people of Babylon guard? What mysteries unfolded in the workshops and markets, in the temples and the taverns, where ordinary citizens gathered to share their own versions of communion and community? And that's where we'll leave it for tonight. From the scribes bent over clay in the dim corners of temple walls, to the king who etched his justice into stone. From the fading bricks of a tower that may never have touched the sky, to the quiet luxury of a Babylonian banquet under the stars. A long, quiet walk through the layered stillness of one of history's oldest cities. If you're still awake, thanks for staying with me to the end. And if you drifted off somewhere between the cuneiform tablets and the scent of simmering lentils, that's perfectly fine too. That's really the whole idea. If you enjoyed this slower, sleep-friendly journey into the past, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. And if you'd like, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it was when you pressed play. It's always lovely seeing where in the world these late-night history walks are finding their way. For now, I'll let the styluses rest, the ziggurat disappear into the dark, and the soft steps of Babylon fade gently into silence. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.